Hadrian put down the this revolt that, remember in 135 CE, you have this revolt by Bar Kokhba, who's revered among Zionists and Jews for, resisting Roman rule. And the story the mythology goes, he, in order to, vengefully erase, the name Judea from history, he replaced it with Palestine. I've written about this in my PhD dissertation. That's just a myth. There's no actual evidence to support that. It's basically just been propagated by Zionists and Jews for the purpose of claiming that basically even the name Palestine itself is somehow like some illegitimate name.
42,000 people watching you right now as well. Not to put some pressure on you, but welcome to the broadcast. Here it is. Can you you can see, right? You can see the video?
Yeah, I can see the video.
Let's pop your video out. There it is. Okay, perfect. And then put you up here. Okay. And you can watch yourself on twitch.tv/HasanAbi if you would like. Hold on. Let me... This. Okay, here it is. Ladies and gentlemen, Zach Foster's in the building. He is a PhD at Princeton and a historian of Palestine. How else would you explain yourself? I don't know. Like, how would you talk about your credentials in the matter here?
Yeah, I'm a historian of Palestine. Got my PhD in Palestinian history from Princeton University in 2017, and I write a newsletter called Palestine in Your Inbox, which you can access at PalestineNexus.com.
Okay, perfect. So I've looked into, I've used the information you posted about the development of Hamas and how Hamas became the formative power despite being a marginal Islamist fundamentalist Muslim Brotherhood cutout that was originally a charity organization. And I thought that was very instructive. And, for that, a bunch of people had posted some of the information that you put out there. Now, this video that we're going to watch from travelingisrael.com, which I thought was just simply an Israeli tourism YouTube channel, has been going viral for the past 5 days. It's already got 3 million views in 5 days. And it is a video that everyone has sent me over and over again saying, Hasan, you have to look at this. Like, everyone is using this video. Everyone is talking about this video. And I thought there's no better person to have explain this video than someone such as yourself, considering your background. And, this is what you have studied. So I feel
That's
like
right.
this will be a more productive conversation than just me looking at it, especially because, like, obviously I have a lot of areas of weakness as it pertains to the history of the Israeli nation state's development. So, without further ado, let's get started. You can hear it, right, when I play this?
This video is going to be interesting, even if
Yes.
you have heard 1,000 different reports
Okay.
about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I promise you that this will give you a new perspective. I will be talking about the settlements, the occupation, the two-state solution, Islam, Jerusalem, the solution, and a whole lot more. Before I break down the Palestinian narrative, a small trigger warning. I like facts. If you don't like what I'm saying, then bring me facts that contradict what I'm saying. If I say that Jerusalem is not mentioned in the Quran, or that the Jews said yes to the partition plan in 1947 and the Arabs said no, or that there was no such thing as Palestinians in the 18th century, then...
So cool. I like that he immediately starts with facts and then goes directly to the Quran, and no disrespect. Look, I was raised Muslim, but like, I don't know about pointing to religious text to make justifications that are fact based. But then also immediately follows that up with 1947 partition plan and how Palestinians were the ones that said no. And I feel like that is a lie by omission, especially considering what was happening in the lead up to that. and also what happened in the immediate aftermath of that, specifically the Nakba, which I assume he is not going to bring up. Do you have any additions on that? We don't have to pause here. There's a lot going on in here.
There's so many problems with this video. I would limit myself to maybe just 10, 15 points in the video where he's just egregiously lying. So I think maybe we can keep going.
Okay.
Feel free to prove me wrong.
I'll speed it up.
Send me a link to a letter from a pilgrim to the land of Israel who says that he met a nice Palestinian. I'm asking you to challenge me. If you just write me that I'm Zionist or that I'm biased or that I've received money from the Israeli government to make this video, those aren't actually arguments. And for your information, I am completely against the current government of Israel. The good thing about Israel is that, unlike most of the Arab Muslim countries, Israel is a democracy. I'm not afraid of the government preventing...
Okay, okay, no. Okay, I'm sorry. This is something I hear from liberal Zionists in Israel, that they do not like Itamar Ben-Gvir, they do not like Benjamin Netanyahu, they do not like the Likud party, and yet, so quickly in the same breath, they say Israel is a democracy. I fundamentally disagree with the notion that you can be a democracy while being an apartheid state. Israel, not by my own assumption, but by every single human rights organization's assessment, is an apartheid state. I think that is 100% a fact. So you can't be a democracy and an apartheid state at the same time.
Me from expressing my thoughts. Israel is not Iran or Syria or Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Gaza, and I don't delete comments. Some people are 100% for Israel and some are 100% against it. I'm aiming for the middle ground. If I get dislikes and smart comments, then I know that this video has reached the right audience. But do give this video a like and subscribe. The last thing that I want to ask is this. Don't use bombastic language in your comments if you don't have the numbers to support it. Ethnic cleansing is a very powerful expression. If in 1948 there were around 700,000 Palestinians and today there are 7 million in the land of Israel, you can't really use this term. However...
Oof. You should pause there. You should pause there.
Yeah, go ahead. What are you going to say?
Yeah, so I would encourage everyone to read an article that was recently published by a guy named Oren Ziv in the magazine Plus 972. And he documents with great detail the ethnic cleansing currently happening right now in the West Bank. You have multiple communities, Palestinian communities in the Jordan Valley that are currently in the process of being ethnic cleansed, and at least 4 communities have already been ethnically cleansed since 2019. The first group was from an area near the Taiba Junction. In May of 2022, 200 residents were ethnically cleansed from Ain Samia. Their homes were dismantled and they fled as a result of settler violence. And those settlers are obviously supported by the Israeli military. In July 2022, another 100-person community was ethnically cleansed from Ras Atin, which is also a Palestinian community in the West Bank. And then again in August 2023, you had 88 residents who were ethnically cleansed from El Qaboon. They were forced to abandon their homes as a result of settler violence and settler terrorism. The name here, I can share the article with you if you want here. It's called... The title of the article I'm referring to, it's called, "It's Like 1948, Israel Cleanses Vast West Bank Region of Nearly All Palestinians."
I also would like to add one addition to that as well. This opinion is here. I'll try to simplify it. You came in with the facts. I have a very simple answer for this. It is not necessarily about the population growth in and of itself, but about what the population growth would remain in Palestine. If 700,000 people were expelled during the Nakba, now the current population of Palestinians in diaspora and Palestinians living in occupied territories and also inside of Israel is at 14 million. Of course, the population keeps growing under horrifying circumstances as well. Pointing to the numbers in Gaza, where the population has increased, to say there has been no ethnic cleansing is akin to Holocaust denial. But also one other argument that I will make is that an Israeli Holocaust scholar, Raz Segal, has decried Israel's assault on Gaza as a textbook case for genocide. So this is an opinion shared by journalists, but it's also an opinion shared by formative scholars that have dedicated their entire lives to covering the Holocaust. But, he's a YouTube guy, this guy. So maybe he's on the money here. But make no mistake, when conditions worsen, that does not simply mean that people are just going to cease to exist. As a matter of fact, when economic conditions worsen, the likelihood of increasing the population and having more children becomes apparent. That's why when you look at the life expectancy in Israel proper, or when you look at the birth rates in Israel proper versus the birth rates in Gaza, you see a difference in the numbers there. That does not mean that there isn't an ongoing ethnic displacement campaign and an ethnic cleansing campaign specifically in targeted neighborhoods that you just brought up. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, just to add one last point, I think it's not just the West Bank where you're seeing ethnic cleansing happening. You're also seeing ethnic cleansing happening in Jerusalem, in the neighborhoods of Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah and other parts of Jerusalem. You have ongoing ethnic cleansing campaigns in which many families, and this is what triggered the May 2021 war, if you recall. You had 58 Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah who were being expelled from their homes. Why were they being expelled? Because they were Palestinian. There's a 1970 law that says Jews can return to home, Jews before 1940, but Palestinians can't. So it's a discriminatory law. It's a racist law that allows Jews to take over Palestinian homes, and that's happening across Jerusalem. It's happening in the West Bank in Hebron. It's happening in the Jordan Valley in near Humsa. So it's happening actually inside 48 Palestine 48 as well, with Bedouin communities in the south that are being ethnically cleansed as well. And now, of course, with Gaza, you have 1 million Palestinians, even more Palestinians that were ethnically cleansed in 48 are now currently being cleansed in Gaza. So this point he says here that Israel is not ethnically cleansing Palestinians is just a straight up lie.
Yeah. One that is not supported by Israeli scholars either. Just propagandists, PragerU videos, Ben Shapiro, charlatans in general, hacks and charlatans.
However, if you want to use the words ethnic cleansing, you can do so to describe what happened to the Jews in Arab countries. In Morocco, in 1948, there were 265,000 Jews. Today, there are around 2,000. In Iraq, there were 135,000 Jews in 1948. Today, there are fewer than 10. Algeria used to be home to 140,000 Jews. Today, there...
Yeah, I think I know what you're going to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Iraqi Jews are well integrated into Iraqi society, really, well into the 1940s. There's credible evidence that suggests that it was actually Zionists that planted bombs in certain Iraqi synagogues that were placed in Iraqi synagogues to scare and blew up and killed a bunch of Jews that scared Jews into leaving Iraq. So I'm not really sure why he's emphasizing the Iraq point here. In certain other cases, there's no question that Jews faced retribution in their own home countries as a result of the Zionist project and as a result of Zionist ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 48. But he's not really doing himself any favors by talking about the case of Iraq, which I think the evidence suggests was actually the Jews that did more so than the Iraqis to scare them into fleeing.
Yeah, and also Jewish migration. I mean, this is a time of Arab nationalism rising. I'm not going to say that there wasn't contention on the ground in the post-colonial formations here, some of which were still under colonial occupation, not by the Ottoman Empire, but instead by France or England, where there was certainly a lot of revolts, riots, and purging. Except this also favored, as far as I understand it, the Israeli state's goal of making sure that they could populate Israel with as many Jewish people as possible, which also, like you said, points to the situation in Iraq, which you're not alone in this assessment. Avi Shleim also says he has proof of the Zionist involvement in the 1950s attack on Iraqi Jews. A British Israeli historian claims in his new memoir that Mossad carried out the bombings to drive Jews out of Iraq to hasten their transfer to Israel. Should we continue?
Yeah, let's keep going.
There are fewer than 50, and I can go on. It is Muslim countries who perpetrated ethnic cleansing on the Jews. But this statement doesn't quite cover what has been happening. Muslims have been doing this to all minorities, not only to the Jews. If you zoom out, you will see that 100 years ago, there were many Christian communities and other small ethnic groups in the Middle East. They are all being wiped out by Muslims. For some reason, the Western world, the Christian world, doesn't want to talk about it. As a Jew,
That's ridiculous. Like, there's also a lot of voluntary migration happening to Israel at this time as well, which is ridiculous because, like, Jews can go back to Morocco right now. This is true. There was a robust and large Jewish community in Morocco. They could go back to Morocco right now. They could live in Morocco as much as they want to, but no such opportunity is afforded to Palestinians who used to live in historic Palestine and want to return back to their homes, to their ancestral homes. Right? I feel like this distinction is important.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think especially towards the end of the video, his bigotry towards Muslims really shines. You know, where he's just really making blanket statements about all Muslims and kind of, you know, just the state of Islam today. And so I would pretty much disregard everything he has to say about Islam and the Muslim world. It's really hateful and bigoted what he's saying. I mean, and it honestly has nothing to do with the broader point of the video, which is about Israel-Palestine. It's a case, it's a sort of a textbook case of whataboutism. This whole point here about, you know, why is it that no one cares about other people in other places? Well, it's sort of like, well, why don't you care about the Uyghurs? Why are you making a video about Israel-Palestine? Why not the Uyghurs? You know, well, it's like, well, yes, there are a lot of other problems in the world, but like, you're making a video about Israel-Palestine, so let's talk about Israel-Palestine.
Yeah.
Care about what is going on with Jews all over the world. And I find it very odd that Christians don't really care about Nazareth or Bethlehem, which are kind of important to the followers of Jesus and used to be 80% Christians 50 years ago and now are 80% Muslims. The same goes for Christians in Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. In Nigeria, Muslim organizations have murdered thousands of Christians. 2 million Christians have fled Iraq and become refugees in the last 2 decades. But
I like bringing up Lebanon when making a video about Israel as though, like, you know, and talking about the conflict between, like, Christians and Muslims in Lebanon while having a conversation about Israel, especially because of Israel's personal involvement, up close and personal involvement in massacres that occurred in refugee camps and in predominantly Muslim neighborhoods at the hand of Christian fascist phalangist militias that the IDF personally sent over to slaughter as many Palestinian refugees and as many Lebanese Muslims as possible. Ridiculous to just, like, overlook that notion as though, you know, as though Israel's hands are perfectly clean in that matter. And many of the other instances where Israel's leveled entire fucking Lebanese neighborhoods, you know, it's just, the reason why I'm stopping on this is because as far as, like, him claiming that he likes facts, it is ridiculous. This has to be a lie by omission at this point. If you are to act like you care about Palestinian lives or Muslims or Christians in that area, I mean, there's far greater harm that has been conducted at the hands of the IDF, as the IDF overlooked and deliberately facilitated the Sabra and Shatila massacre, for example.
no one seems to care about them, neither the media nor the universities. Everyone is obsessed with the Palestinian refugees. Did you know that the UN has 2 agencies for refugees? One for hundreds of millions of refugees all over the world, and another one called UNRWA, which is only for the most privileged refugees on earth, the Palestinians.
That's... Go ahead.
So, well, one thing I would point out here is that this refugee agency, UNRWA, was established in the aftermath of, shortly after World War II, when the Jews faced persecution by Nazi Germany, and millions of Jews perished. And I think one of the reasons, by the way, why, the UN and the United States at the time never really said much about the creation of the Palestinian refugees. There were even like New York Times columnists on the ground in Palestine that were reporting on what was happening. And the New York Times chose not to publish some of those articles. There was essentially, I think, owing to Holocaust guilt and owing to guilt on the part of Americans and Europeans, there was desire not to speak out against what the Zionists had done to Palestinians in 1948, and also kind of give Palestinians sort of maybe some extra special treatment in the UN. That's an argument made by Ilan Pappé recently. So You know, it's like, well, you're kind of leaving out a lot of important facts to the story.
It's ridiculous to say that Palestinians are the most privileged refugees and not recognize that the UN has a special refugee status for Palestinians due to the inception of the Israeli state and the, you know, ethnic displacement that occurred. But of course, I like that he says this is the Israeli perspective you've probably never heard. And this is literally the perspective, the only perspective that I've ever heard. You know, so I don't know why he's saying that. I've heard the UN special privilege refugee status so many times by people that that want to defend Zionism, who never talk about why these Palestinians became refugees. Like, how did that happen? Did they materialize out of thin air? Did they just become refugees due to, I don't know, some volcano or a natural disaster? Or was it the deliberate ethnic displacement in the hands of Zionist brigades, some of which personally called themselves terrorists, as a matter of fact? Okay.
Don't just take my word for it. Check it out for yourself. So let's talk about the story the Palestinians like to tell and the media like to repeat. The Palestinians lived in Palestine for hundreds of years. They lived peacefully alongside a small Jewish minority until the rise of Zionism, a colonialist movement which, under the umbrella of the European imperial powers, started kicking the Palestinians out of their land and homes, causing the current situation. And now for the facts. In the long history of the land of Israel, there was never such a thing as a Palestinian people until the 20th century. Millions of pilgrims have come to the land of Israel over the last 3,000 years. They've come across Jews, Arab, Christians.
Or actually, let's just finish this thought. Let him finish this
Muslims,
thought, and then we'll
Turks,
comment.
They've never met a Palestinian. Now, you might say, regardless of whether they have existed as a nation, all people should enjoy human rights, and all people should have the right to identify themselves as they wish. And I agree. You have the right to identify yourself however you like, but you don't have the right to reinvent history. And the history of the region is very clear. This is probably the most documented piece of land on the planet. There is a very good book, a very ancient and popular book about the connections of the Jews to Judea. It is called the Bible. Now, wait. I know what you are thinking. He's going to say that God gave this land to the Jews. And no, if you believe that God gave this land to the Jews, great. And if not, also great. The undeniable point is that there is a strong connection between the Jews and the land of Israel. There are thousands of books from the last 3,000 years that write about Jews and the land of Israel.
I'm going to tell you, and he's going to say something that's false in a second.
In archaeological digs, we find Jewish coins, Jewish texts.
Yes, we know they were ancient.
Sorry,
well, we know they're. Well, it's sort of all irrelevant. Like, nothing he's saying is really that interesting right now. Everything he's saying is well known, and yes, there were ancient Israelites that lived there 3,000 years ago. It's not really relevant to ethnically cleansing Palestinians in 48 or slaughtering 3,000 Palestinians in the last 11 days. It's just not relevant information. He's just kind of, you know, telling you that things that they just don't have any significance today. But there's a point he's about to make, which is false. So if you just let him finish his point.
Oh, about the coins?
There isn't a single book or piece of archaeological evidence that point to a Palestinian people. You don't like what I'm saying? Then prove me wrong. But
well, I mean, you know, if you believe that your right, your right to ethnically cleanse is dependent on whether or not your great grandfathers and grandmothers lived in this country 3,000 years ago, then I suppose you make a good point. Or, however, if you believe that your political legitimacy is dependent on, you know, whether or not you respect international law and whether or not you have a free and fair democratic system, then, you know, it's completely irrelevant. So he's just kind of spewing off a Zionist narrative that is just sort of disconnected from the reality today.
Couple of conversations that I've had on this, couple talking points that I've brought up on this against this very common claim is that, one, 3,000 years of history is not a justification. What is the time frame that is like, what is the time frame and how long you lived there where it's completely justifiable to go to an area and just, you know, kill all the people that live there and like forcibly expel them from their land? Can the Native Americans come back and kill every single American in neighborhoods with militarized brigades and then forcibly expel them from the cities that they live in? Is this the basis of a land back movement? Of course not. So that's number one. No one would consider that to be justifiable. Everyone would understand that that's ridiculous. Also, not a single Native American person advocates for this kind of thing. And they have a far closer history to having permanent ownership of this land than the Israelis do in their justification for it. So that's number one. Number two, the other side of this is the notion that there is a religious pretext for why this land is important to Jews. And when you look to the fathers of Zionism, like Theodor Herzl, and who was, as far as I understand it, a secular Jewish person, and the different areas that they looked at to create a self-described colonial movement, a nation state for Jews all around the world. They looked at, I believe Antarctica is one of the edge cases, Uganda, Argentina. And also Argentina. So the notion that this was Israel and Israel always, and it was supposed to be in historic Palestine, is, yes, I mean, there were attempts made. Herzl went to the Ottoman Empire to purchase the land originally, or to develop Israel as we understand it there, and he was, of course, told no. Not Antarctica, Alaska, sorry. I said it wrong, my bad. It was Alaska, I apologize. So the idea that this is like anything but a colonial movement is disputed by the founding fathers of said movement, that openly said that there were native Palestinians living there at the time, and that they would actually prove difficult to expel, and also that this was a colonial movement in general.
I would just add one or 2 points to that, because he's about to say in just a minute or two that Zionism was not a colonial movement. And what's really interesting is that, as you correctly pointed out, the Zionists themselves talked about the colonization of Palestine. They use that word, colonization, colonies. And in fact, for example, you have institutions called the Jewish Colonial Trust, the Palestine Jewish Colonization Society. And what's even more interesting is that one of the earliest and most important and most significant Zionists, his name was Arthur Rupin, who was basically in charge of the Zionist office that was based in Palestine in Jaffa prior to World War I. And so this guy, Arthur Rupin, so he's born in Poland, and and so he saw what was happening with the German Colonization Commission. And so because at the time, during his upbringing, the German Colonization Commission was basically colonizing his hometown and his home area, his home region, which was called Poznan. And so basically what the German government was doing at the time, they were settling farmers on land that was bought from Poles in order to transform the demographic character of Poznan and West Prussia from Polish to German. Okay, and so this actually was a source of inspiration for Rupin, and he explicitly talks about it in his memoir, and that he was basically he was inspired by German colonization efforts in Poland. In fact, he even hired a former official of the German Colonization Commission also to advise on how to best transform the demographic character of Palestine from Palestinian Arab to Jewish. So this idea that Zionism is not a colonial movement is something that obviously most Zionists wish was true, because colonialism has a bad rap these days. But the fact is, Zionism was a quintessential colonial movement. And in fact, it was a quintessential settler colonial movement. And so, it's just, he's just spewing propaganda at this point. But we'll get to that point in the video very shortly.
Yeah.
It is much more than that. The connection of Christian and Muslim to Jerusalem is based on the Jewish connection. Jesus was Jewish, and the connection of Muslim to Jerusalem is also based on the Jews. Let me explain. I will go even further and say that Jerusalem was never the capital of a Muslim empire. It was always Cairo, Damascus, or Baghdad. Jerusalem was mostly important to the Muslims when they were fighting against the Jews or the Christians. Under Muslim rule, Jerusalem was often a very neglected city. This makes sense, as Jerusalem, which is mentioned some 600 times in the Jewish Bible, isn't even mentioned once in the Quran. Chapter 17 of the Quran talks about the night journey of Muhammad. He ascended from Al-Aqsa, which means the most far away mosque.
I would just say that all this history that he's narrating right now is completely irrelevant. Like, Whether or
Yeah.
not Jerusalem is holy to Jews or to Christians or to Sikhs or to Buddhists has nothing to do with ethnically cleansing Palestinians in 48. It has nothing to do with dropping bombs and killing 1,500 innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza in 2014. It has nothing to do with 40 years of occupation. And you know, so it's just he's kind of, it's just like, dude, why are you telling us all this? This is just not relevant to what's happening today.
He's trying to pad the stats because contemporary history proves him any defense of the Israeli nation state to be pretty morally repugnant, in my opinion. So that's precisely the reason why he's like going back to 3,000 years of history, which is not an argument you could ever use for any other for any movement whatsoever. There is not a single serious like land back movement advocate that would make this same argument. Like they would never do that. They would never use that as a justification. No serious advocate would ever push for this, to ethnically displace people that have been living on land for hundreds of years at this point. So it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's just cruel. I don't know. That's
come
it.
to be associated with Jerusalem. In order to understand this, you need to go back to the Jews. The Jews had two temples on what is now known as Temple Mount. The temples were located on the holiest site for the Jews, which is the top of Mount Moriah. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the second was destroyed by the Roman Empire. 60 years after the Romans destroyed the temple, the Jews rebelled again, and the Romans changed the name of their region from Judea to Palestina, and this is how the name came to be. It was intended to disconnect the Jews from the name
That's
Judea.
a lie, by the way. I don't think it's worth getting into, but there's this myth among Jews that, you know, Hadrian put down the this revolt that, you know, remember in 135 CE you have this revolt by Bar Kokhba, who's revered among Zionists and Jews for, you know, resisting Roman rule. And so the story the mythology goes, you know, he, in order to, you know, vengefully erase, you know, the name Judea from history, he replaced it with Palestine. I've written about this in my PhD dissertation. That's just a myth. There's no actual evidence to support that. It's basically just been propagated by Zionists and Jews for the purpose of claiming that basically even the name Palestine itself is somehow like some illegitimate name. So, but it's just total nonsense and propaganda. Even the history itself. I mean, if you actually look and dig into the sources of, like, did Hadrian change the name from Judea to Palestine? The answer is we don't know. It's just mythology.
Well, I think it's also projection, because that is precisely what the Zionist brigades ended up doing after the Nakba, as they gave Hebrew-sounding names to formerly Arab villages. And you know, and basically destroyed all of the Arabic structures in certain villages as they planted European trees on top of them to permanently destroy any semblance, any cult, like any. There was a period of, like, I guess, de-Arabization. Is that a proper term for it? I don't know. Where they tried to completely remove the Arab culture in that area. And that wasn't 3,000 years ago. That was, you know, around 1948. So, and in the aftermath of 1948, in the inception of the Jewish state. So remember that.
700 years after the destruction of the temple, the Muslims colonized the land of Israel and said that Muhammad ascended to heaven from the place where the Jewish temples stood. Now, at this point, you may well be saying, what? The Muslims believe that Muhammad ascended to heaven from the exact same spot that is the holiest site for the Jews, and this is not written in the Quran? Yes, and if you find it strange, that's because you don't know Jerusalem. Nothing makes a place more holy than competition with another religion. The Muslims took the place which was the holiest for the Jews 1,500 years prior to the existence of Islam and made it their third holiest place. Don't believe me? Here is a pamphlet of the Waqf, the Muslim authorities, that say that this is the location of the Temple of King Solomon. Although what I'm saying here is very basic history, there is a good chance you don't know about it, and I don't blame you. You hear so much about the conflict, but the media tends to forget the basics. Jerusalem was always the center of Jewish life. Muslims turn their back on Jerusalem when they pray towards Mecca, and Jews pray towards Jerusalem. When Jews get married, Part of the ceremony is to say that we will never forget Jerusalem. Jews have almost always lived in Jerusalem, even under the harshest conditions. Since the 13th century, the Muslims haven't allowed the Jews to pray at their holiest site, the Temple Mount, and the Jews have had to pay extra taxes and...
Wait, since the 13th century, they haven't allowed Jews to pray at the Temple Mount? Is that true? I thought that the Ottoman Empire, especially after the Ottoman control, it was like this area was where Jewish travel was perfectly permitted.
So this guy's he doesn't really understand Judaism very well, because most religious authorities, the most halachic authorities, it is forbidden for a Jew to go up to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound to enter into what used to be the Temple Mount. Why is that? The reason is because in ancient times, in biblical times, the Jews went and prayed at the temple during 3 times a year, and the holiest day of the year on Yom Kippur, the chief Kohen, in the ancient world, the ancient Israelites had Kohanim, were basically the priests, and once a year the head of the Kohanim would go into this room called the Holy of Holies, Kodesh HaKodashim. And this person, who's the holiest Jew, was only allowed to enter this one place once a year. And Jewish theology had it that if any Jew were to ever walk into that room and any other day other than that 1 year, they would be immediately killed, because that's the holiest site, that's the holiest spot in Judaism. And so only one person is allowed to enter that room once a year. And so if you actually ask most ultra-Orthodox Jews today, even many Orthodox Jews today, even many conservative Jews today, they will not enter the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. They will not even go up there, okay, out of their own desire not to accidentally cross over that Holy of Holies place, that Holy of Holies site. So he's just, I mean, like, Jews themselves have, like, basically decided on their own accord not to go up there. So I'm not even really sure why he would even bring that point up. It's just not really relevant again.
Yeah, patting the deck.
Suffer harassment. They have even had to pay the Muslims a fee to pray at the Western Wall, the closest to the Temple Mount.
There's another point here that I would make, which is that I think most historians agree that Jews fared much better in Muslim lands under Ottoman rule than they did in Christian Europe. I mean, this is a point I think that's pretty much accepted by all.
I hate that. Yeah, I hate when they fucking look. Not to be too Turkish here, okay? Because I shit on Turkey quite a bit, the Turkish government quite a bit, but that is pure ahistorical nonsense when you fucking act like the Ottoman Empire was not always a fucking safe haven for Jews historically oppressed by pogroms everywhere. They escaped Spain and came to Istanbul. Morocco was another place as well. Like these are the notion that Arabic populations have always been anti-Semitic is a really dangerous myth that is entirely removed from any kind of historical context whatsoever. Jewish people and Arabic people, including Arabic Jews in general, why is there Arabic Jews is a question you should be asking, have always coexisted in far better conditions than they did in Europe, and than they did under Tsarist Russia, for example. So it's very frustrating. Did they pay a tax? Yes, they did. Just like Christians did, just like all non-Muslims did. But they fared far better and had far better conditions always. All right, I'm going to move on.
They were allowed to pray. The Islamization of Jewish sites hasn't only happened in Jerusalem. In Hebron, one of 4 cities that are holy to the Jews, there is the Cave of the Patriarchs, which according to tradition is the place where Abraham was buried. To humiliate the Jews, Muslims didn't allow them to enter the building, and Jews were only allowed to walk up to the 7th step. Only in 1967, when Israel liberated Hebron, were Jews allowed for the first time in 700 years to enter the second holiest place for Jews. Why do I say liberated Hebron and not conquered? I will get to that in a minute. And now we get to the interesting part, the 19th century and Zionism. Jews have always migrated, or as we say in Hebrew, gone up to the land of Israel. In the 17th and 18th
pause right there,
centuries.
because that's a lie. So he's fundamentally distorting Jewish history. He's trying to paint a picture that for hundreds, if not thousands of years, Jews have always been, you know, as he said, Jews have always migrated to the land of Israel. I mean, this is just total nonsense. Again, if he knew anything about Jewish theology, he would know that he's just spewing myths and propaganda, because for the overwhelming majority of Jewish history, it was actually forbidden for Jews to migrate to Israel. And the reason was very simple, which is that in the end of days, Jews have eschatological beliefs, just like Muslims and Christians. And the eschatological belief among Jews is that Jews should not live, let alone move to the Holy Land until God decides so. It's God's decision. Belief that Jews believe that human action to hasten the arrival of the Messiah violated Torah law, and therefore you're not only are you not allowed to live there, you're definitely not allowed to move there. And so, you know, he's kind of really distorting Jewish history here. It's really a grotesque distortion, I would say.
Yeah, the Orthodox, you see it in like the Torah Judaism account all the time, chat. The Orthodox Jews that are still anti-Zionist, this is where they're coming from. This is what they are stating when they say that Jews are not supposed to have a land. They're not supposed to have a nation state until the Messiah comes. That's the reason why some Orthodox Jews, not all, of course, there's varying degrees of thought there, are some of the most serious anti-Zionists.
Jews came from all over the Jewish world, from Europe, from North Africa, from Yemen, in small numbers due to the harsh conditions, but there was always a steady movement. The first Zionist Congress was held in 1897, but 50 years beforehand, in the 1850s, there were more Jews than Muslims in Jerusalem. In the rest of the land, yes, there were more Muslims, but it is important to know that even before the start of the Zionist movement, there were dozens of Jewish settlements in the land of Israel. In the last decades of the Ottoman Empire, as in all empires, there were lots of different groups. Some groups got bigger with time, some smaller, some bought land, some sold land. Many European powers bought land for institutions, and some groups, mostly Germans and Americans, settled in the land of Israel to speed up the second coming of Jesus. Many different groups. None of the groups...
Damn, I'm glad that he's saying that. I mean, this is actually, unironically, a perspective that most Americans are unfamiliar with. One of my favorite, reasons as to why there are so many Western settlers, so many American evangelical Christian groups fund these Zionist projects, specifically settler expansion, because they want to speed up the rapture. You know, it's cool that there you go. We found one truth. He said one thing. He brought up one genuine truth that in most circumstances people do not know about or share.
Use the word Palestinian to describe themselves. The first Zionist Congress took place in 1897. The Zionist movement was a national movement, not a colonialist or an imperialist movement, but a national one.
We already debunked that
one
myth.
of many.
Yeah, we already covered that part.
It was the age of the fall of empires, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, and of the rise of national movements. And the Zionist movement was the national movement of the Jews. It is as simple as that. In the first half of the 20th century, millions of people moved from one place to another.
Yeah, I think I make this distinction quite frequently. I wonder what your perspective is as a historian. Like, I talk about post-colonial nationalist movements being very different than like an established nation state engaging in a nationalist movement. The difference would be like Germany versus like Pan-African national Pan-Africanist movements or Pan-African nationalist movements like that were launched against colonial occupation. Like, nationalism as a means of emancipation is very different than nationalism when you've already established a nation state. And for the Zionist movement to simply be considered a emancipatory nationalist movement, it would have had to existed under colonial occupation as a well-established group of individuals and not like 3% of the population total in historic Palestine that peacefully coexisted alongside the majority Muslim and Christian population, right?
Yeah, I mean, Zionists like to call Zionism a national movement. I think the more accurate historical framing is that it's a settler colonial movement. And what do we mean by settler colonial movements? You have many of them. They, to Australia, to the United States, to the Americas, to Canada. And I think what makes settler colonial movements is that the people who are leaving their home countries have made a decision to basically to sever their ties with that country. And that's why they're settler colonial movements rather than just colonial movements. Because you have lots of colonies. You had a lot of colonies all around the world. In most cases, those colonists wanted to preserve their connection to their home country. That was not the case with Zionism. In fact, and that's why some scholars have even called settler Zionism an ideal type of settler colonialism, because more so than almost any other settler colonial movement, the Zionists said, fuck Eastern Europe, we're moving to Palestine and we're not going back. Whereas many British colonizers and many French colonizers who came to the New World actually wanted to preserve their connection to their home countries. So strictly speaking, when you actually, if you ask scholars to say what is the most ideal type of a settler colonial movement, I think Zionism ranks very high on that list.
To create nation states. What's special about the Jews is that they never stole or used violence to take any land in the land of Israel. I'm always getting comments from Muslims and pro-Palestinians about Jews stealing the land from the local Arabs. Here is a challenge for you. Give me the name of one village that the Jews stole from the Arabs from the 7th century when the Arab Caliphate colonized the land of Israel until 1947 when the Arabs started a war to wipe out the Jews. From the year...
We can pause it if to talk about this, because first of all, I think this whole, strictly speaking, I don't have any disagreements, but he's losing, what's that expression? You lose sight of the forest for the trees. So the only reason Zionism came into existence was because of the use of force by the British Empire. Okay.
Yeah.
You have to realize that the overwhelming majority of the local Arab Palestinian population rejected Zionism and Zionist immigration and Zionist land purchases. In fact, you even had an American commission, the King Crane Commission, show up to Palestine in 1919 and ask the locals, do you support a Zionist program? And 85% of them said, no, we reject Zionism. But of course, the democratic will of the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine was irrelevant to the British.
Yes.
So and the British exerted a tremendous amount of force to suppress that will, and they suppressed protests with violence, and they completely ignored the petition submitted by the Palestinians. So it was, of course, through the use of force, of course, British force, but nevertheless, a tremendous amount of violence and force that brought Zionism into existence and enabled Zionists to migrate to Palestine. So again, he's kind of using facts to distort history.
Yeah. Yeah, no land was stolen is wild. I mean, that's a wild take. That's a wild take to look at settler expansions happening in the West Bank right now, today, when we're, as we're having this conversation. But it's certainly a wild take, especially when you look at it from the lens of the Israeli nation state and its development. But I guess it's myth making in a sense, right? Because that's why some historians will dispute the Nakba being a organized effort by militant brigades that were trained by the British colonial occupying force at the time, and that they specifically had information detailing each Arab village and its occupants and points of entry and whatnot that they immediately seized on, or started seizing on even before, while the British occupation was still occurring in British Mandate Palestine. And the reason why this is something that could be even disputed, I guess, because one, the Israeli government refuses to declassify this information, despite the fact that 50 years have passed, and we're actually nearing 25 additional years on that 50-year passage of time, so that they could declassify this information. But also, this is the reason why they could say, oh well, they left on their own volition. The Arabs left on their own volition, as a matter of fact. There was some back and forth fighting, but the Arabs ultimately left on their own volition, which is ridiculous and ahistorical. There are still people who participated in said purges, violent purges, including the Deir Yassin massacre, one of the most famous ones, both at the time and also throughout history, where that one 95-year-old Israeli army IDF reservist who participated in that Deir Yassin massacre is still trotted around despite being a psychopathic terrorist who committed unspeakable crimes in Deir Yassin, who the Israeli government still sends over to the troops to, increase morale, as they say. Anyway, silly.
636 till 1947, not a single square foot was stolen by the Jews. Again, if you don't like what I'm saying, then prove me wrong. Give me the names of villages that Jews stole prior to the War of Independence. On the other hand, I can give you lots of names of...
Prior to the War of Independence. Sorry, my mom is here. Yeah. So what's happening? Did people just leave on their own volition? How did that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think when he gets to 48, it's really telling because he spends about 6 seconds on the most important moment in Israel-Palestine history. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. I think one thing to remember here is history and narrating history is all about what you emphasize and what you omit. Right? That's the case, and that's the case with whenever anyone's writing the history of anything. And so, I think that kind of tells you everything you need to know, that he basically glosses over 48 as if nothing happened. But anyways, we'll get to that point.
All right.
Jewish villages that Arabs, or Palestinians, if you will, destroyed before 1948. Take Hebron, for example. Jews lived in Hebron for hundreds of years. In 1929, the Arabs, not 1 or 10, but whole gangs of Arabs, murdered 70 Jews, and the ancient Jewish settlement had to be abandoned until it was brought back into Jewish hands in 1967. You want more names of Jewish villages that were abandoned because of Arab violence? Here are some more. Many were rebuilt after a few years. The Arabs used violence against...
Every single one of these is like the 20s Arab revolt, right? Against the British occupation for the most part, as they recognized that they were slowly being displaced by a colonial occupying force that was purposefully ridding them of the land and trying to engage in ethnic displacement, which they were right about, by the way. Their means and their methods might not have been, but their suspicion that they were going to be inevitably displaced ethnically was absolutely correct. That's why Israel exists in the way that it does. And the arguments that I guess he's pointing to are those villages, right? He's saying, like, look at all these villages that displaced Jews that were living there.
Yeah, well, look, I would say that he's really distorting history here. I mean, if you I was reading pretty recently about the Jaffa riots of 1921, and according to at least a number of accounts, Zionist gangs basically, sort of entered these neighborhoods in Jaffa that were Palestinian. And, there are many accounts where they started harassing Palestinians and, threatening them and, basically like, exerting their, control over Palestinian neighborhoods, and there were clashes of violence, and violence broke out, and little do you know, like some Zionists got killed. But it's like the Zionists were actually the aggressors in those cases. But again, he's not interested in trying to understand what happened, right? He has no interest in understanding what happened in the Jaffa riots in 1921, or in the Nebi Musa, demonstrations in 1920. He's not trying to get at the history. He's just plucking out little factoids that sort of paint the story he wants to paint. And so it's just a classic case of a propagandist. I think if you were to teach a class on propaganda, you would use this video to illustrate what propaganda looks like, rather than some like actual serious narration of history by a historian.
Yeah. I do want to point out that I'm not saying it was justifiable in any meaningful capacity to forcibly engage in any kind of pogrom or any kind of ethnic displacement, whether it be Palestinians or Jews at the time, through violent revolts. But the party that was defended by and militarized by the colonial occupation at the time in British Mandate Palestine were absolutely way more militarized than the Arabs were at the end of the day, which is why the 1948 Nakba panned out in the way that it did. All right, let's continue.
Jewish civilians in the land of Israel many years before the occupation and many years before the land of Israel was established. And by the way, they didn't only use violence against the Jews. Christians suffered as well. Remember the German and American settlements I told you about? They suffered as well. The family of John Steinbeck, the American novelist, had a farm outside Jaffa, or at least they had it until Arabs broke in and murdered Steinbeck's great uncle and sexually assaulted his wife and his daughter. Here is an interesting anecdote.
That's okay. I'm sorry, but when you're talking about when you're getting to 1947 and talking about like Arabs sexually assaulting and murdering villages, like the numbers are on the board. Okay, it's 6,000 total in defensive or 6,000 Zionist forces killed. In comparison to the conservative estimate of 15,000 Palestinians, okay, some of which led to the entire villages leaving, thinking that they'll be able to return, never to be able to return as well, and the atrocities were absolutely unimaginable and numerous, even ones that we have knowledge of due to the fact that those veterans are still alive to this day and will openly reveal the things that happen. And the victims, in some instances, are alive to this day. So, yeah, that's I don't know. I feel like that's very disingenuous to point this out and, like, invoke John Steinbeck. Do you have any take on this?
I was not familiar with this event. I didn't bother to look into it. Again, it's... He's plucking out little factoids that paint a picture that the Palestinian Arabs were, just violent, rapist, sexist. It's just incredibly dehumanizing when you leave out all the other facts that, actually Zionists committed all these mass atrocities against the Palestinians. He's just painting a picture that dehumanized Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, dude, this being portrayed as not only like by I feel like historians that talk about this sort of thing, talk about what happened in the lead up to the Nakba and after, will at the very least paint it as like a both sides affair. Whereas this guy doesn't even do that. He just completely removes the atrocities committed by Zionist brigades. He completely removes that from the equation. Doesn't even talk about like the violence that British people were subjected to, which, by the way, they fucking deserve it. Let's be real. I mean, but even like even the bombing of the hotel by, I think it was Irgun or was it Leahy, one of the terror cells at the time, like blowing up a hotel and numerous other positions as well, where there were British military officials when they tried to stop mass immigration of Jews from coming into the British Mandate Palestine. So it's odd not to mention any of those things and simply to say that, like, Arabs were going into settlements and killing people and raping them, when the reverse of that happened at a systemic level in the hands of a much more militarized, trained, experienced force that was at a certain point, I believe, more than 100,000 strong. Some of the groups literally had experience fighting in combat in World War II against a bunch of Arabs that did not have any kind of real way of defending themselves, had a severe lack of weapons to be able to defend their villages, and in many instances, like Deir Yassin, did not even believe that their villages would be attacked because they had a truce pact with Jewish villages in their surrounding neighborhoods, and therefore did not think that they would even need to militarize their neighborhoods and have standing guards and any kind of militia presence whatsoever.
One thing I would add here to the point that he's using facts to distort history is that one of the reasons Zionist militias were so successful in 48 in expelling all of these Palestinians from their villages was that in the preceding decade, actually Zionists, were establishing military files and dossiers on every single Palestinian village.
Yes.
Ilan Pape writes about that in his book Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine in 48. And the reason those Zionist agents, spies, let's call them, were able to access those villages is because they were invited in and welcomed by the Palestinian Arabs.
Yeah.
In fact, to their own fault, actually, they were quite open and open-minded to the Zionists. And this goes all the way back to the 1880s and 1890s when many of the first Zionist agricultural colonies failed. And it was actually only through Palestinian Arab assistance that many of them were able to even survive in those early few decades when the Zionists were from Eastern Europe. They didn't know how to farm. They didn't know how to tend to their animals. And so actually so Palestinian Arabs assisted Zionists in those early decades, and then also we're generally speaking open and welcoming to Zionists, even Zionist spies and agents in the decade prior to 48. So again, he's using facts to distort history. The history of Palestinian Arabs is actually one which was quite, again, I think to the fault of the Palestinian Arabs, more welcoming to Zionists than it should have been.
Yeah. For the record, it's not just Ilan Pape, but also people are still alive from people that survived these atrocities or perpetrated these atrocities are still alive to this day. And this is, in spite of the Israeli government's best efforts, information that you can access directly by hearing it from the militia forces, the veterans that were formative in the establishment of the Israeli state, specifically as far as the intelligence officers that you mentioned that were gathering information on surrounding Palestinian villages. Some of them are entirely conflicted about their participation in the onslaught. 1948, Creation and Catastrophe is a great documentary that looks at and directly interviews veterans on the Israeli the Zionist brigades at the time, and also the Palestinian veterans that took up defensive positions at that time as well. So these people are still alive, you know. Yeah, Irgun and Haganah are the two formations that they still have veterans that are alive that, you know, they went and asked about. There's a guy by the name of, I forget, is a Mordecai something, but he is the one who gathered all of the intel on Deir Yassin, who he then saw the atrocities committed on his intel and was and openly talks about how devastating that was for him, not realizing what would happen. Now, you might not believe him, but I mean, that is Vanunu Mordecai. I think, is that his name? It might be. Hold on. Let me just make sure. I don't know if his, no, I don't think it's Vanunu Mordecai. Anyway, whatever. All right, let's continue. It's not Vanunu Mordecai.
Two other great American novelists, Mark Twain and Herman Melville, visited the land of Israel, and like hundreds of other pilgrims, they wrote about how neglected the land was, and many wrote about how violent the local Arabs were. From 1970
We'll
to
just pause
1948,
real quickly there
the
because no serious historian uses these memoirs of American racists to tell the story of the local Palestinian Arab population and what they thought and what they did and what they believed. In fact, historians today, they use local sources. So they use local Arab sources. They use memoirs of Arabs. They use diaries of Arabs. They use Islamic Sharia court records produced by Arabs. They use Ottoman records produced by the Ottoman officials. But it's just you're discrediting yourself when you're explicitly telling your story of the history of the Palestinian people through the lens of these American travelers who spent a couple of weeks in the Holy Land, didn't speak a word of Arabic, had the Orientalist images of Arabs in their head, and were incredibly racist by their own, according to their own writings. So it's just strange. He's just discrediting himself by citing these sources as like what you should as evidence of Palestinian beliefs of anything.
Yeah.
British and the French were in control of the Middle East. The Jews blamed the British for being pro-Arab, and the Arabs blamed the British for being pro-Jewish. I will tell it as it was. The British were pro-British. They had two main interests in the region.
True.
To have oil.
Okay, never mind. He's right. Okay, there you go. That's the second fact that I agree with.
By the way, how he said the Jews blamed the the British for being pro-Arab until 1936. That's just a straight up lie. I mean,
Yeah.
from 1920 to 1936, the British and the Zionists were like peanut butter and jelly. I mean, he's just wrong about that.
Yeah. And I would, yeah. I
Flowing
agree.
from Iraq
And then,
to the port
and then
of
things
Haifa,
started to change in
and to ensure
1940.
this
But
West
even then, like, anyways, yeah, we
Yeah.
can keep
Canal
going.
remained
It's not that
open.
interesting a point.
And because both of these interests lay in the hands of the Arabs, they were pro-Arab. Today it is very fashionable to be against colonial powers. And of course, they did do a lot of damage. But I find it absurd that pro-Palestinians are anti-colonial, as it was the Roman Empire that gave the name Palestine to the area. And
This is ridiculous. Okay, dude. Yeah, no, for real. Everyone has the right to invade Africa because, we all came from Africa. Like, come on. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
He's really discrediting himself at this point. Like, bringing the Roman Empire into things.
It's like,
because
dude, it's like Mongolians deserve the world, okay? It's their planet, actually, all the way to wherever they pushed the Anglo-Saxons or
I mean,
it's like,
like
it all belongs. The Greater Mongolia.
Because, first of all, we already said that the Roman Empire may or perhaps may not have named the place Palestine. That's a myth that he's now using as fact to say that because the Roman Empire called this place Palestine 2,000 years ago, therefore it's strange that Palestinian Arabs are against colonialism. I mean, just think about that sentence for a second. And that's what this guy's telling us, okay? So, I think that sort of like tells you as much as you need to know about how much credibility this guy has.
Let me tell you, I think his perspective is revealed when he goes, now colonialism is not fashionable. Like, I think that's what his real perspective is. When it's like, if colonialism was fashionable, he'd still be like, yeah, this was a colonialist movement and we liked it and it was
the
good.
British Empire that gave it its borders. When the British and the French drew lines on maps, they invented two nations that never existed before, the Palestinians and the Jordanians. Another fact that is often overlooked is that
that's actually the subject of my dissertation research, and he's just full of shit. I mean, he's just straight up lying right there. So his argument, when the British drew the colonial boundaries around mandatory Palestine, they invented the Palestinian people. So I published a paper a few years ago with Emmanuel Beshka, a colleague of mine, and we found the term Palestinian in Arabic sources something like 114 times from 1898 to 1914. So before there were any British colonizers in Palestine, Palestinians had already been calling themselves Palestinians for 2 decades. And actually, if you go into Western sources and English sources and German sources and Russian sources, you actually have, the term Palestinian is being used already from the 1870s onwards. So he's just regurgitating and repeating lies that have been debunked already for years.
Wasn't this partitioning process was also done by like the population centers, right? I thought that originally it was like wherever, and even then it was actually quite unfair when it was like a 50-50 split, despite the fact that Jews at that point had 20% of the population and 80% was Palestinian, and yet the population split was still land split was 50-50.
Yeah, we'll get to that, and we'll get to 47 in a few minutes. But yeah,
I misunderstood. I thought he was talking about this.
The Palestinians and the Jordanians. Another fact that is often overlooked is that pro-Palestinians are always talking about Jewish immigrants coming from Europe. No one talks about the Arabs who came to the land of Israel. Hundreds of thousands of Arabs from Egypt, Syria, and other places entered the land of Israel in the 1930s.
That's a lie. We should pause there because this was debunked already in the 1980s. So in I think it was 1984, a woman by the name of Joanne Peters published a book called From Time Immemorial, in which she made this argument that he's making right here. That's the source of the argument. Shortly after that book was published, Norman Finkelstein took that book and dissected it footnote by footnote, sentence by sentence, and determined that the entire thing was a fraud. She literally falsified documents. She invented facts. She was fast and loose with the numbers because she's talking about demographic data, right? And this book was determined to be a complete fraud already in the mid-1980s. And I would say actually one of the most serious historians of the British mandatory period his name is Yehoshua Porath. He published an op-ed, and this guy, by the way, is no friend of the Palestinians. I think he's pretty Zionist. But basically, he published similar to Norman Finkelstein. He basically determined that that entire book, literally from beginning to end, was fraudulent. She falsified records and invented documents and sources. And so this guy is, again, here's another instance where this guy is just repeating and regurgitating things that have been debunked for 40 years. Okay, and then we can address the second point he makes shortly after that.
Okay.
To work for the British and are now seen
These
as
are just
native
lies
Palestinians.
right now. He's repeating.
It is hard to estimate the number of Arabs who entered the land.
I will just add one more thing, which is, why is it that Zionist propagandists like this guy repeat things they think are true, but why do they love telling you that it was actually Egyptians and Syrians that moved to Palestine rather than there were indigenous native Palestinians living there already? Why does he love this point, which we already know is a myth, but why does he wants to tell you that? Because in order to again, it's all about trying to erase the Palestinian people, pretend they weren't there, they didn't have a real identity, they didn't have a connection to Palestine, which is part of this broader initiative among Zionists to dehumanize the Palestinian people. That's why he's bringing it up, and I just think that's important to point out.
Isn't it also, like, doesn't it also kind of come with the recognition that, like, it's almost like Arabs have lived in that area for much longer periods of time at this point than Jews have. So he's trying to use like Arab Jews as a way, falsely, but still as a way to be like, no, we are native. See, like we have Arab Jews, and they wanted to move there because they had like a calling to move there. Like I feel like it comes with the recognition almost that like Arabs are more deserving of this land than Europeans, Jewish or not. I don't know. Maybe I'm extrapolating information that is not accurate.
He's about to say something that is, in my opinion, absurd. Which is, let's just let him finish this point here, and then I have another comment to make.
Okay.
Land of Israel between 1917 to 1947 to work for the British as the borders were open, but the number is in the hundreds of thousands. Probably about half of the population of Gaza came to the land of Israel.
He's just lying. He's just spewing misinformation right here. These statements, there's no evidence to support what he's saying right now. He's just straight up lying.
Israel during the British Mandate time. Their last names usually hint towards the actual origin of the family. I find it absurd that people like my great-grandmother, who came to Israel from Eastern Europe in the 1920s after dreaming about a Jewish homeland for generations, are seen as white colonialists, while Egyptians who came to work for the British in 1945 are seen as native Palestinians. Now you might be saying,
okay, I would pause there. I would pause there because I think it's a very insidious point he's making. There's one key difference, by the way. And of course, there were migrants from Egypt and from Syria. He's not wrong that there were migrants. By the way, Palestinians also migrated to Egypt and Lebanon and Syria as well. There were people migrating everywhere in all directions. But there's something very insidious what he's saying here, which is he's trying to say, well, what's the difference between an Egyptian and a Zionist? Well, I will tell you what the difference is. The difference is that, the Egyptians and Syrian migrants, they integrated into local Palestinian society. They spoke Arabic. They went to Palestinian Arab schools. They, participated in the Palestinian organizations. They participated in the Palestinian scouting troops. They assimilated. Whereas the Zionists did not assimilate. They had no desire to integrate into the local population. Instead, they created an exclusionary society with separate schools and separate institutions with the purpose of eventually taking over the country.
Despite the fact that originally Arabs, I'm sorry, but weren't there Jews living there already who were not exclusionary inherently for years and years, like the 3% of Palestinian Jews living in historic Palestine?
100%. In fact, there were great relations generally speaking, there were great relations between Arab Jews, Arab Muslims, and Arab Christians on the eve of Zionist immigration. We have anecdotes from the literature. Amos Oz is a famous Israeli novelist. His father relayed to him an anecdote that he shared in his memoir, in which you have Jewish children and Muslim children playing in the same courtyards together. Okay, in Jerusalem, they shopped in the same street, in the same stores. They lived in the same buildings. They actually celebrated one another's holidays together. I know this is kind of crazy to think about, but Jews celebrated Ramadan with Muslims. Muslims joined Jews in places like Sheikh Jarrah to celebrate Jewish festivals together. Christians celebrated with Muslims, and basically Zionism wrecked all that. When you had one of the populations, the Jews, decide that no, this land is Jewish land, and we're going to control it with a Jewish government, with Jewish institutions, and build an exclusionary Jewish society on top of this Arab land. That kind of wrecked the harmonious intercommunal relations that dominated prior to Zionist immigration to Palestine. So yeah, you're 100% correct. There were, generally speaking, very good relations between Jews, Muslims, and Christians on the eve of Zionist immigration to Palestine.
One point to consider here, I don't think you use the term assimilation, but I don't think you mean like forcible assimilation, but more so, I guess, trying not to exclude others from the culture of the land. It's more integration than assimilation.
Correct. That's what I mean, integration. In other words, wherever you have a population migrating from one place to another, I think the local population appreciates when you learn the local language, when you go to local schools, when you work in local stores and local businesses, right? But the Zionists did none of those things, and the Arab, the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Lebanese did all of those things.
Where they came from, and if they have been here for generations, they have the right to self-determination. And again, I agree. In 1947, the UN proposed the division of the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jews said yes, and the Arabs said no, and then started a war in a bid to eliminate the Jews. The morning after the partition plan, Palestinians attacked Abbas and murdered 5 Jews. This is how the war was started. They were offered a state, they said no, and start murdering Jewish civilians.
Yeah, this is pure garbo. I don't think you can find. Is there even like Is there even a dispute? I feel like this is. I feel like to say that this was Arabs immediately fighting against Jews at this point is a lie by omission, right? Like it's not like this started in 1948.
That's exactly correct. I think the basic problem with this story, again, is plucking out facts to distort history, which is to say that to pretend like that there wasn't already 20, 30 years of rejection, of resistance against Zionism, that Zionism, wasn't fundamentally a violent movement that sought to displace and depopulate the land, I think is sort of the history and the context that's being left out here. And I think more importantly, what he does after, he basically says, and in the next minute, he says, well, you know what, like the Arabs started the war, so, it's their fault that there are 750,000 Palestinians, is a class at 750,000 Palestinian refugees. It's just a classic instance of victim blaming, especially when you consider that in the years after the war, Zionist forces, the Israeli government and the Israeli military shot live ammunition at the Palestinians who were trying to return to their homes after the war. And so to pretend like, it's actually the Palestinians' fault that that the Zionist forces expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their homes and then shot at anyone who tried to return their homes is just so grotesque and disingenuous. It's just a classic case of victim blaming, and you're completely leaving out the whole story of 1948, which we'll see in a minute. He just breezes right by it, but he just completely ignores what actually happened in 48, which was 800 Palestinians were massacred.
It's not even 1948. The expulsions had started before 1948. Before the expulsions happened under British watch. The start of the expulsions happened under British watch. The idea that this is happening in 1948 is ridiculous. There are firsthand accounts from British police that were there documenting the back and forth fighting where, once again, a tale as old as time itself, the Jewish militants were, the Zionist militants were significantly more powerful than the Arab militias were, which were almost always in a defensive posture in general.
The other thing to point out about the partition plan, and I think you already mentioned this, but partition plan gave, I believe, it gave most of the country was given to the Jews, even though they only constituted, I believe, 33% of the population of Palestine at the time. And the only reason they were 33% Jewish was owing to British violence. So even, but on top of that, they only own 6% of the land. Right? So they own 6% of the land. They're 33% of the population. The only reason they're that many is because of British violence. Even though they get like 55-60% of the total surface area, of the total land of British Mandatory Palestine. So of course the Palestinians are going to reject that. It's completely insane. And then on top of all that, something like 40-45% of the population of the proposed Jewish state was going to be Palestinian Arab. The whole concept of partition was that, Jews, where there's majority of Jews, you have a Jewish state. When there's majority of Arabs, you have an Arab state. But actually, Arabs were like almost 40-45% of the Jewish state. So there were so many things that were just so incredibly unfair to the Palestinians.
No, it was absolutely gerrymandered. Yes, areas that were predominantly Jewish was mostly Jewish, whereas Arabs coexisted with Jewish people in areas that now Jewish forces or Jewish villages would be controlled by the Zionist militias. Yeah, absolutely understandable conflict that would not arise out of nothing.
Not a single Jew was spared in all of the places that fell into local Palestinian hands. Luckily for us, after 15 months of fighting the local Arabs and the 5 Arab armies that invaded Israel, we won. And yes, during the War of Independence, many Arab villages were destroyed and about 700,000 people were displaced. That's what happens when you try to wipe out your neighbors. You might...
So that's what happened. So
that's fucking insane.
Yeah, he's also lying when he says that's what happens when you try to wipe out your neighbors. In fact, there was a pact between King Abdullah of Jordan and Ben Gurion during the war that basically said, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. You don't invade the land that was proposed to the Jewish state, and we'll let you have the West Bank. That was actually an agreement. So he's totally wrong about that. In addition to that, the Zionist forces were actually much stronger than the combined forces of the Arabs, and so they got weapons from I believe Czechoslovakia during the war, and then France shortly thereafter. And so he's also just blaming Palestinians for being ethnically cleansed by Zionists. So I'm not quite sure how anyone can take you seriously when you say that.
Yeah, it is unimaginable to me for anyone who has ever read any kind of history of Nakba, even from Zionist writers on the matter, for you to leave that historical moment thinking like, oh well, sucks to suck. You tried to expel your neighbors, and that's what you get. You have to be fairly cruel to come to that conclusion, because these expulsions early on were horrifyingly cruel by design, because and also well documented, like you said. Ilan Papez talked about this and written about this as well, about the actual written cleansing inside of the Zionist brigades, like where they were very purposely, systematically wiping out entire villages, going in, doing horrifying things, and then letting the word be spread that if they come to your village, if you see a Zionist brigade come to your village, you better run, because they're going to do the same things to you. The one example that I've used quite a bit is really horrifying, but this is from first-hand accounts of those who actually survived the atrocities in Deir Yassin, where the Irgun brigade had entered the village while the Arab forces in general were, I think, mourning the loss of an Arab leader in a prior attack on a Jewish village in Jerusalem, and the village itself was, like you mentioned, under a pact of peace, a peace pact with the surrounding Jewish villages, and did not think that it would ever come under attack. A pact of this pact would ever be violated. And one thing that they did was, after lining up every single person in the village, shooting them, doing horrifying things, taking earlobes and throwing people in wells, they took a father and his son and stood them in front of an oven that was burning. And they told the father to throw his son in the oven. When he did not comply, they beat the father up, threw the son in the oven, and then threw the father in behind him anyway. This is firsthand accounts of some of the atrocities. They took the remaining survivors and brought them back, I believe, to Jerusalem and paraded them as the people, as the onlookers threw rocks and trash and spit on the remaining survivors from said village until they actually killed the remaining survivors and kept them around, kept their bodies around for an extended period of time. Again, eyewitness first-hand accounts from not just Palestinians who survived, but also Zionist forces that participated in the atrocities, and the veterans themselves have mentioned this. This is like first-hand accounts from the direct veterans that were involved in it. So when atrocities like that are kind of hand waved away, when they played a really significant role in the mass expulsion, I think that you're doing yourself a disservice if you are trying to offer us facts about the history of the inception of the Israeli state. Right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah. Also, a reminder that a lot of the militant forces were trained by the British police at the time, and also had weapons, and some literally had actual combat experience from World War II. So it's very, I feel like it's a very different circumstance than a bunch of dudes with like whatever stolen guns that they had trying to defend their villages.
Will lose and have to pay the price. At the same time, 800,000 Jews were brutally expelled from Muslim countries. For some reason, no one cares about them or want to tell their story. Millions of articles and papers have been written about the Palestinians who had to evacuate their homes because of a war they started, yet very little has been written about the Jews living in Muslim countries who were subjected to pogroms and had to flee, even though they were innocent. Please tell me why you care so deeply about the Palestinian refugees, and yet you couldn't care less about all the millions of other refugees.
I don't understand it. Like, they're in Israel. Like, what? They're not currently... Is he saying that, like, the Jews that went to Israel are refugees still? Like, they want to go back to, they want to go back to Arab nations, but they can't? Is that what he's saying?
Yeah, I mean, that's what it sounds like. I don't think very many of them want to go back to their countries of origin. But again, this is sort of just like a classic case of whataboutism. Do you want to talk about Israel-Palestine, or do you want to talk about what happened in Morocco or Iraq or Egypt? It's just like these are different issues. And this has been a long-standing Zionist desire to try and bundle in what happened to Jews in other countries with the Palestinians. Guess what? The Palestinians have nothing to do with that. They weren't responsible for that. They were, if anything, it was because of the Zion. I mean, this has been a long-standing problem with Zionist history, which is that Zionists commit all these atrocities, and then Jews around the world face retribution. By the way, there's nothing unique about Zionism or Jews. This happens everywhere in the world. Where if you have a Muslim commit some horrible act in India, other Muslims face retribution for that. The same is true, by Hindus. The same is true pretty much in the U.S., right? The same happened after 9/11 when, after the towers came down and there was this gruesome attack against American civilians, you had all this racism and hatred against Muslims in America. You had the same after COVID. You had all this anti-Asian hate because there was a perception that, it was a Chinese virus. So again, this is just like, it's just like, A, whataboutism, B, this has nothing to do with Israel-Palestine. So again, he loves distracting us with things that are not relevant to the question at hand, which is like the history of Israel-Palestine and what the Zionists did to the Palestinians and what the Palestinians did to the Zionists. That's what we should be focused on. And he's just kind of distracting us with all these other things.
Yeah, I don't understand the argument if I follow it to its logical conclusion, like, I guess he's trying to say that, like, well, Jews don't have a right to return to, like, their nations of origin. And I feel like if there was a united Arab front that got together and dealt with, like, not the Abraham Accords, but something that actually was conciliatory, and they said every single Jewish person can go back to their nation of origin as long as every single Palestinian can go back to Israel and Palestine, I feel like there's 0% chance that that would be popular in Israel proper right now, right? Like, no, I know that it's not popular because I hear the arguments all the time. I'm surprised he hasn't made it yet about the about the demographic change that would ruin the robust culture that Israel has developed, and numerous other like great replacement theories that Zionists present as though it's like perfectly valid to say that, in the same breath as like invoking the Holocaust and why there needs to be a nation state for Jews there where they have the majority. And for me, I understand, like I understand the long and complicated and horrifying history of constant pogroms and the Holocaust as well, and why Jewish people spiritually would want a place to call home. It's just that the counter to that is not a possible hypothetical ethnic cleansing that might happen that is Islamist fundamentalist, and the only way to stop that is by doing your own ethnic cleansing campaign that is supremacist in the other direction. All right, let's continue.
Who had to flee at the same time. 14 million Germans, about the same number of Hindus and Muslims, Ukrainians, Armenians, Poles, people from the Balkans, and I could go on and on. The Palestinian refugees are the most privileged refugees in the world. Some say that the partition plan wasn't fair, as the Jews made up 1/3 of their population, but got 2/3 of the land. To that I will say this. The Arabs actually also got what is now known as Jordan. So in fact, the Jews got a much smaller part. And I should also add that
I mean,
that's awesome.
Put down this is such a ridiculous point. The Arabs got Transjordan. There were no Jews living in Transjordan. I mean, do you want Jews to be given a country where they don't even live in? I mean, it's just such a ridiculous point.
Well, I mean, they did get a lot of land where they didn't live, so why not Transjordan too? What do you mean? Which is the reason why like the original Irgun logo, it features Transjordan as well.
That's right, it does.
Yeah, they did want that, which turned into Likud, I guess.
The Arabs got all the good land, and the Jews got the swampland and the desert land.
I mean,
I'm going to state a fact.
That point is also ridiculous, by the way, because the Jews migrated to lands that were swampy because that's where they were able to buy land, right? They were not able to buy land in the mountainous interior to the same extent as they were in the Galilee and the coastal plains. And so they were given the land. And so when the partition plan was devised, the whole concept was wherever there are Jews already living, that's where we're going to make a Jewish state. And wherever there's primarily Palestinians living, that's where we're going to make a Palestinian state. And so he's just sort of, he's like, well, but the Jews get given the swampy land, but that's because that's where the Jews were living. And that's where the Jews were able to buy land. And there are reasons for that, which are historical, which we get into if you're curious. But it's just like, it's just like such a ridiculous point.
Isn't that the basis of the? Isn't that the basis of for a people without land, a land without people? Like that's the positive, I guess, as far as I understand it. Like, yeah, obviously Palestine was populated by people, but there were certain parts of this land that did not feature, like they did not have a lot of people in it, and that's what the original like kibbutzim formations were, right? I mean. Like it wasn't always violent, is what I'm saying. It wasn't always done through violent means.
Yeah, I mean, Zionists bought land wherever they were able to, wherever there were Arabs willing to sell them land. And it turns out that they were able to buy land in these areas that were actually somewhat undesirable, right? They weren't the places where Palestinian Arabs had large population centers, right? If you look at where the largest Palestinian Arab population centers are in historic Palestine, we're talking Hebron, Nablus, Jenin, Jaffa, Gaza, Jerusalem. You're either talking Haifa, Akka, you're talking about the coastal cities, and then you're talking about the mountainous interior. But those coastal plains in between, where basically Jews were able to buy land, were essentially the most undesirable land, and that's what the Zionists were able to buy, because that's what Palestinian Arabs were willing to sell them. And so he's sort of just, he's losing the forest for the trees here.
Fact that is definitely going to annoy all the haters of Israel. The Jews took the swampland and the desert land and made the impossible possible.
Oh.
We turned the land into gold. Israel is pioneer in.
Oh, the supremacy. Oh, the classic, like, Arabs like to bomb and live in sewage. Jews like to build shit. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it just stems from a belief in, honestly, Jewish supremacy. I mean, that's what this is. These statements about how, you know, Zionists drained the swamps and turned you know, desert into gold. It's just, again, it's just the belief that we are superior to other groups, and it kind of feeds into everything that's happening right now. It's just the dehumanization of Palestinians.
It also is like always enforced through the real life conditions that Palestinians are subjected to in Gaza. Like whenever you hear someone say, oh, well, they get billions of dollars over the course of like 20 years, and yet they haven't built a singular thing, or, oh, they busted down the greenhouses and blew up the water pipes to make, you know, weapons, and, oh, Palestinians can't get fucking cement into or concrete into Gaza because if they do, then they build tunnel systems and whatnot. And it's like, it always is a reinforcement of that same, like, Palestinian Arabs, like Arabs in general, do not have ingenuity. They have no way of like envisioning a better future. And it's not because of the conditions that they were subjected to historically, and instead simply because they are inferior. And that argument is probably very familiar to many of you here in this community because it's fucking identical to the colonial mindset that white people had when, you know, colonizing Africa and many other parts of the world, as a matter of fact. It's a
Absolutely
justification correct. That it serves the purpose of dehumanizing your colonial subjects and justify all of the atrocities and all of the humiliation that you subject them to because they're not as superior as you are. I mean, this guy can try and hide it, but it's jumping out here in this situation. Like, oh, we took the swamps and, you know, made it into gold. What did the Arabs do?
Yeah, I mean, it's also, if you think about where most of these Jews were coming from, they were coming from Europe. And Europe, over the course of the 18th and 19th century, plundered and colonized the entire world and extracted massive amounts of silver from the New World and plundered India and plundered China. And in the course of all that plundering and colonizing, they became rich. And the Jews of Europe benefited from that. And they benefited from the universities and the wealth that was created in Europe. And then they brought that to Palestine. So kind of in some sense, in some very twisted sense, that this is evidence actually of kind of, you know, a history and a legacy of European violence and colonialism.
Yeah.
Irrigation systems and desalination system. Israel invented vegetables and fruits that can grow in salt water and yet taste sweet. As for the Arabs, the large part of their land is now polluted and contaminated. After 1948, the Palestinians
I'm not really sure what he's even referencing there. That's just like straight up racism. Like, the large part of Palestinian Arab land is polluted? Like, where's he even getting? Like, I've never even heard that propaganda before, by the way. So he's like innovating in his propaganda, but like I don't even know what the fuck he's talking about right there.
Dude, that is like, it's always so funny because it's like you can be as monstrously racist as you want to be as long as it's like against an imperial enemy. You know what I mean? Arabs, the historic enemy of the Western world, but certainly in the post 9/11 world, you know what I mean? Like, you could just kind of say whatever the fuck you want about Arabs and people will go, yeah, they're all terrorists, right? Like, it's whatever. Yeah, they live in sewage. They live in filth. They did it. They couldn't make anything. If you said this, and many racists do say this, about black people living in Africa, this would be understandably a white supremacist perspective. It is a white supremacist perspective, yet again, when you say victims of your own constant expansionist settler colonial project are actually left behind due to their own, I guess, cultural, maybe not genetic, but cultural inferiority. That's what he's trying to infer. That's what he's trying to say here without saying it. It's the classic trick that Ben Shapiro applies when talking about black people in America, where he'll say, oh, it's their culture. It's not their, it's not necessarily that, I'm not saying they're genetically inferior. I'm just saying they're culturally inferior.
What's so insidious about his point is that, you know, he's saying that, you know, Arabs polluted. I think he used the word pollute, okay? And what's so insidious about making that argument is that it was actually recently revealed. There were many rumors and there were many reports of this earlier, but I think the definitive proof is now in that the Zionists used chemical weapons. They poisoned Palestinians in 1948. They poisoned Palestinian wells in 1948. Okay, so, and then, by the way, they did this same thing in 1970 when there was a desire to take over some Palestinian land to build a settlement in 1970. Zionists, we're talking about the state of Israel, poisoned Palestinian wells in the area where the Palestinian village was so that they would leave and Zionists would take over. And
wow.
so actually, it's actually the exact opposite of what he's saying is closer to the truth.
So different than what's happening now when you see videos of the Israeli government pouring cement into water wells, you know? Oh, wait, no, it's identical. And that's what I keep referring to whenever I talk about this issue is like, since 1948 and even earlier than that, the tactics of settler colonial expansion have been identical. Throughout time, the only thing that's changed is like the weapons have gotten better, the surveillance technology has gotten better, but the overarching fundamentals are still there. It's always the same. Oh, well, you know, we sent flyers in to tell you to evacuate northern Gaza before we bomb northern Gaza, so we push you into southern Gaza and then inevitably offer you a humanitarian corridor to leave and live in Egypt, never to return. That's something all too familiar to Palestinians. They've experienced it. They've heard it from their parents. They heard it from their they experienced it with their grandparents that they can never see ever again, because if they leave Gaza, they might not be able to return back, or if they leave the West Bank, they certainly will not be able to return back. This is an ongoing reality for them. So ultimately, it's just not much has changed. To understand the ongoing cruelty of the Israeli apartheid regime, you can look at any other moment in time, and you will see the exact same justifications of the most moral army and the only democracy in the Middle East.
To establish a free Palestinian state, as they were under Egyptian and Jordanian rule. Yet they didn't do that. In 1964, the Palestinians established the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now this is 3 years before the Six-Day War. So before Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and before a single settlement was built, they were already calling for the destruction of Israel. When the Arabs say free Palestine, they don't mean we want an independent Palestinian state next to Israel. What they want is a Palestinian state that replaces Israel.
What do you got for that? Oh, we got the babies with Hamas.
First of all, when Arabs say, anyone who starts a sentence with the words, when Arabs say free Palestine, they mean, again, is, I think, overgeneralization would be an understatement. I mean, to paint all people, all Palestinians, all Arabs with a single brush is just like racist. It's just ridiculous. Like, even if a lot, it's just like, yeah, I don't know. It's sort of hard to engage with somebody who has no problem generalizing all people, painting all people with a single brush.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's yeah, all Palestinians just want to like wipe out Jewish people. That's what they want for sure. Except if you look at like any kind of polling, even exit polls from like the election that ended up putting Hamas in power, the exit polling showed even back then a succession of violence and a two-state solution. There was definitely points in time throughout the history where Palestinians were absolutely on board with having their own nation state and peacefully coexisting. It's just that, to my understanding at least, and maybe you can tell me I'm wrong, Israel has used that as an opportunity to consistently squash any kind of conciliatory effort from Palestinians that were made in good faith, and continued its endless expansion, both originally in Gaza and in the West Bank, certainly, and continue to expand in the West Bank still to this day.
I think what's particularly odd about this footage he's showing here is that just a second ago he was talking about the PLO. The photos he's showing here are Hamas.
Yeah.
Okay, that green flag is Hamas. Why are you showing Hamas photos in a discussion of the PLO? Remember, the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist in 1989. All the while he's saying they're supporting the destruction of Israel. So I just it's sort of hard to, deal with these points in good faith when he's just, telling you one thing but showing you something else, and painting all Arabs with the same brush, and just kind of, again, like, not actually sharing any data or any facts or any evidence to support his points, just making these broad, sweeping generalizations.
Palestinians kept rejecting all offers made to them from 1947 till 2008.
This is my favorite. This is, okay, can we talk about this real quick? Palestinians rejected every offer made to them from 1947 till 2008. This is something that you hear from every propagandist hack, every charlatan. This is like, I assume this is like a militarized Hasbara talking point, because I hear it way too frequently. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, so I think the most generous offer, quote unquote generous offer made to the Palestinians was in Taba in 2000, between Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak. The first
who
point
I may or may
not
not be seeing tomorrow after on a broadcast that I am going to be on.
Yeah, he's that's very interesting. Would be curious to hear more about that. But but basically, the first thing to say about this offer is that it was a verbal offer. It was not a written offer. And some analysts say that a verbal offer is not an offer. If you want to make an offer, it has to be in writing. So that's the first point I would make about that. That all these offers, actually, even throughout the entire Oslo peace process, even in Camp David in 2000, everything was oral. And so that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is that, this quote-unquote generous peace offer included the following. Israel was not required. Israel made no concessions whatsoever on the Palestinian refugee issue. They didn't even acknowledge taking any responsibility in creating the refugees in the first place. Now, let me ask you this. How is it that you expect to be able to come to a final status peace negotiations when you're incapable of even owing up to and acknowledging the crimes committed 75 years ago by your own state, the crimes that led to the establishment of your own state? Your inability to even acknowledge that you took a responsibility and played a role in creating the refugees was a huge, huge non-starter for the Palestinians. That's point one. Point two, all of these offers involved Israel maintaining security control of the Jordan Valley and the border with Jordan for a period of at least 20 years into the future. Now, let me ask you this question. How is it that you're supposed to have an independent state and have autonomy in your state and have self-rule in your state when you can't even control your own border? These weren't serious peace offers. There was never an attempt to explain how Palestinians would be able to maintain a connection between Gaza and the West Bank. That's the third point. The fourth point would be the offer that Palestinians would have control of Jerusalem was actually they would have control of Abu Dis, which sits actually outside of Jerusalem. Palestinians were never offered a capital in East Jerusalem, in the part of Jerusalem where you actually have Palestinians living, in the Haram al-Sharif compound, in the Muslim quarter and the Christian quarter and the Armenian quarter of the Old City. That was never offered as part of the capital of Jerusalem. And they were never, so when it comes, and then on top of all that, Israel insisted on maintaining 3 military outposts in the West Bank.
Yes.
Do the Palestinians get 3 military outposts in Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jaffa? No, they don't. So the entire framework was, how is it that we can allow for some amount of Palestinian autonomy whilst Israel still maintaining control of all the land between the river and the sea? And when you understand that that was the fundamental principle upon which Israel engaged in these negotiations, you realize that it was never fair to the Palestinians. These offers were never serious offers. And so, I don't know, it's just, now, I have plenty of criticism for the Palestinians, by the way. They didn't make a counter, Arafat never made a counteroffer at that Taba. So I'm not here going to pretend like I have any lost love for Yasser Arafat. But I'm telling you that the Israelis,
with Camp David, wait, hold on. With Camp David, much was written about how Arafat had actually in private conceded, according to American authorities that were there outside of Clinton, obviously, but that there was actual concessions made from Arafat's side. But of course, they later said, no, we never conceded to anything, even though they had quietly even offered up parts of West Bank as well. as far as I understand it. But then they personally said no in public far after the deal had fallen apart in an effort to save face, at least to my knowledge.
That's a great point. No, I think you're absolutely right about that. And in addition, I think the other thing to remember here is that the entire peace process was taking place under American auspices and through American diplomatic channels and using American negotiators facilitating the entire process. And anybody who knows anything about the United States role in the Israel-Palestine question knows that, the entire foreign policy team of Clinton's entire foreign policy team were like right-wing Zionists. I mean, Dennis Ross. I mean, the people leading the American negotiation team were applying an incredible amount of pressure on the Palestinians, while at the same time applying zero pressure on the Israelis. And Diana Buttu, a Palestinian Canadian, who played a role in the negotiation process, shared some very, very interesting anecdotes recently in a podcast she recorded with, I believe El Maidan is the name of the podcast. We can probably share a link if people are curious. But she explained how in many of the draft versions that she would be getting of like documents that were shared by the by the Americans, there would be comments left in the margins from the Israelis like, oh, you shouldn't say this or you shouldn't say that. There was no distance between American and Israeli positions. It was basically the United States and Israel on one side of the negotiating table and Palestinians on the other. And how is it that you're expected to conduct negotiations between the most power when your negotiating partner, when the person you're trying to negotiate with is the most powerful country in the world and allied with the person who is controlling and occupying you and besieging you for 50 years. I mean, that's the other point to remember here, which is that, another interesting point made by Diana Buttu is that during those negotiation processes from 2000 to 2006 and 7, the Palestinian negotiating team would have to travel from Ramallah to Tel Aviv, because the meetings were taking place in Tel Aviv. And she relays these anecdotes whereby, every time they would have to drive to Tel Aviv, they would have to cross through Israeli checkpoints. And they would be berated and harassed and forced to wait hours in the sun with no water, just to arrive at the negotiation table. It's like, how do you negotiate with someone who has their foot over your neck? But that was basically the nature of Israel-Palestine negotiations from 1993 to the present, which is you have someone who you're negotiating with who is all the while taking your land, demolishing your homes, arresting you, imposing checkpoints on you, humiliating you, killing you every day, seizing your land, destroying your property. And that's the person you're supposed to be negotiating with? There's some semblance that these were fair negotiations?
Yeah. I made a mistake when you were talking about Taba, as the chatter is clarifying. Ehud Barak and Arafat weren't at Taba. They were at Camp David, in which Barak gave embarrassingly bad offers. And even then, there was concessions made as well. Taba was the best offer until that point, and was put to an end suddenly as an election was coming up, along with other factors. In parentheses, the teams in a press conference later said that they had been given a little more time, they would have probably reached an agreement. Annapolis was technically better, but cut short due to courts chasing Olmert.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's how is it that you're expected to negotiate with a person who has their foot over your neck? I mean, that's kind of, I think, how you need to interpret these negotiations, which is that Israel had all the power and Palestinians had no power. And when you're in a position of no power, trying to negotiate with someone who has all the power, and at the same time, the framework within which these negotiations were taking place, i.e., American diplomats, American sites, Camp David, right? American pressure that basically. There was no semblance that Palestinians were going to get a fair deal here, because most of the pressure was really being applied on Palestinians from Americans via the Israelis.
All the while, for those of you who don't understand the circumstances on the ground, the apartheid state is strengthening its grip around the Palestinians. The occupation is worsening, and the what B'Tselem calls the permit regime is being enacted. And slowly but surely, freedom of travel is lost in this time frame for Palestinians who used to be able to freely travel from ostensibly from the West Bank to Gaza to Israel proper, even, and work in these areas, and the situation worsens in dramatic ways that they can experience and see, and is even humiliating in many ways. So I think that this is an important factor to consider when discussing it, especially when you want to understand of the Palestinian liberation fronts branched out into more violent means over the years. It didn't happen because there was some interest that, like, oh, they want to forcibly rid all of the Jews through violence through Israel, and more so, regardless of what charters even Hamas had, that its methods became more and more violent as a response to the horrifying violence that Palestinians were subjected to. And that kind of violence is often lost on Americans because it's a legal structure. It's done under the auspices of the state. So we are sometimes subject to it ourselves. You know, Black Americans understand it, I think, especially throughout history. But most living in the imperial core have no way to comprehend this this kind of systematic destruction of all civil liberties. We're not talking specifically about like gay rights being taken away or abortion rights being destroyed and the criminalization of abortion at the hands of the Supreme Court. It's like that times 1,000, and that in and of itself is also horrifying too. I'm not minimizing that at all, but in order to try and empathize with this plight, you have to comprehend that this is like every aspect of your life, and everything that you've known and your normal day-to-day existence is being destroyed systematically by an incredibly militant state that very openly is saying your existence on this land, on your ancestral home, is contentious.
When Ehud Olmert, the Israeli prime minister, offered the Palestinians all the West Bank and East Jerusalem as their capital, they said no to every offer that was made to them, invested all the money they received from the world in terror, and then cried that they were their victims.
I mean, look, at this point, he's just speaking in such extreme generality. It's like all the money was used for terror. It's just like you don't need to respond to someone who's sort of speaking with grotesque overgeneralizations. So, I mean, he's just kind of showing his own hand right now. He's showing his true cards, which are, you know, I am deeply anti-Palestinian. I am super racist against Arabs and Muslims more generally, and I have no desire to actually understand what Palestinians were using their money for and what they weren't.
Zach, can I say something here, though? Yeah. I think it would be, I can't believe in the audience, I think this is racist, but also offer counter examples. Many people receiving this information, this carefully cultivated over the course of the war on terror universe that they were born into. So it sounds like a stupid thing to say, to like counter his racism with facts, but I think it's important to do so. I don't know. If you have anything to say about specifically this aspect, maybe the relationship between Hamas and other secular factions and the ongoing conflict between them, and how it was not a monolith, in spite of the fact that this demon over here is fucking.
Palestinians rose up against the occupation and, you know, started throwing stones at soldiers and tanks, and so Israel didn't want to be policing the streets anymore, and so it was like, how can we basically still maintain control of everything, maintain the occupation, maintain the control of the maritime coastline, and maintain control of the Jordan Valley, and then maintain control of the entire borders of all of Israel Palestine, while at the same time extracting ourselves from those day-to-day kind of violent encounters. Let the Palestinian security forces do that. And so I think, and so yeah, that's what a lot of them, a majority.
This also, I think, is important to understand in analyzing contemporary Palestinian existence. And like, you saw an aspect of this yesterday when the West Bank was not protesting the Israeli occupation, but what they see as an extension of said occupation, which is a bus. I mean, there's the Palestinian Authority, as far as I understand it, is quite contentious at this point because it has basically become another imperial vestige, a a part of the Israeli security apparatus, routinely working against the interests of Palestinians, as the Israeli government, through endless settlement expansions, have partitioned off the West Bank in its entirety and has made Palestinians' lives in the West Bank unimaginably awful. And now Palestinians see the PA as a group of individuals who like give up 14-year-old stone throwers to the IDF when asked for it, and that's certainly I think that certainly is the Israeli design for the situation, in an effort to slowly but surely push people further and further into the hands of more radical fundamentalist Islamist groups like Hamas, and portray all Palestinians as Hamas in an effort to, complete the ethnic displacement and find the justification from within that, oh, well, all Palestinians are Hamas. They all want, they all want the old Hamas charter, the 1988 charter. Look at their old charter where they said they want to expel all Jews by force. And in order to maintain the security state, we must do everything in our power to purge them violently. I don't know. Do you disagree with anything I said so far? There might be I might be reductive.
No, I think you're completely right that most Palestinians see the Palestinian Authority as part of Israel's occupation rather than representing some kind of rejection or resistance to it. I mean, this has been the case for a long time now. Just was it June, July, when Israel went into the Jenin refugee camp and leveled, an entire neighborhood, displacing something like 3,000 Palestinians from Jenin. In the aftermath of that heinous attack, Palestinians held funerals for the Palestinians who were killed during that attack, and there were a number of senior PA officials that showed up to the funeral. They were booed. They were forced out. They were kicked out of the funeral procession. Yeah. Because there was no desire, there was no interest in having these PA officials who themselves allowed the Israeli forces to enter Jenin in the first place. Remember, Jenin is ostensibly under the control of the Palestinian Authority. Most of the major Palestinian population centers in the West Bank, Ramallah, Beit Lahem, Nablus, Jenin, Hebron, Khalil, they're all under Palestinian authorities' ostensible control. And yet, Israeli military raids go into those areas on a near daily basis, all with the consent and approval of the Palestinian Authority. And so to pretend like the Palestinian Authority are somehow, defending the Palestinians is absolutely insane. And that's why, by the way, you just saw earlier, was it yesterday or today, masses of protests in the streets of Ramallah and elsewhere in the West Bank, protesting, obviously, not just Israel, but also protesting the Palestinian Authority.
Yes, exactly. And once again, I want to reinforce this. That was deliberate. That was by design. That is precisely why in a closed-door meeting in 2019 to Likud members, Benjamin Netanyahu purposely said, we control how high the flames go. Anyone that wants to thwart the nation-state development project of Palestinians must treat Hamas as the single force in the room. That the I think ritualistic humiliation of the Palestinian Authority is a part of that design. That you only negotiate with Hamas, you make Hamas to be the only force for Palestinians. This way, internally, you get to justify all of the atrocities in the interest of security, because you're the security candidate and you're Netanyahu. We have to consistently squeeze the Palestinians over and over again. And I think that is by design. Like I said, it's a two-front war. Neuter the Palestinian Authority, use them as your own, as a part of your security apparatus, and then only reinforce the power that Hamas has by dealing with them exclusively, sometimes through violent means and other times through even allowing funds to go to Hamas as the singular force in the Gaza Strip. So I feel like that is the reason why we're in the position that we're in now, and that was actually well reflected by not just like Gideon Levi, but many other Israeli thinkers. Even the entirety of the editorial opinion board of Haaretz, right? I mean, this is precisely what they were saying when they said October 7th is entirely in the hands of a security candidate that claimed that he could keep Israelis safe and secure, and failed on that promise because they kept pushing and pushing and pushing and being more and more violent. This is why it was called the Al-Aqsa flood. Like, this is not a justification for the atrocities in any capacity, but there's a reason why the operation was called the Al-Aqsa flood. It was supposed to be a response to the violence that Palestinians are subjected to right there, right?
Yeah. Look, you don't need to trust Haaretz or Gideon Levy. You can just look to the statements of Israel's right-wing leaders themselves. Bezalel Smotrich, who's currently the finance minister, said, I believe it was in 2015 already. So we're going back 8 years. He said, Hamas is an asset, while the Palestinian Authority is a liability. Why is that? Because because the Palestinian Authority is the people you have to deal with to create a Palestinian state. But if you empower Hamas, then you don't have to worry about ever having to give up any land, or ever having to give up a Palestinian state, because the entire world rejects Hamas, and so that's a non-issue. So basically, number one, Hamas is the asset because you have the right wing doesn't want to create a Palestinian state. Number two, Hamas is strengthened and is allowed to exist and persist and even strengthen itself, so that Palestinians remain divided. And this has long been a tactic of Israel, to drive a wedge between different Palestinian factions. That was the entire reason why they funded and supported Hamas in the early 1980s, was to drive a wedge and try and undermine the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, their main adversary at the time.
Yeah.
And so this has been a long-standing Israeli tactic, which is to divide and conquer. It's a colonial strategy, by the way, no surprise. But you're 100% correct.
Yeah, it's a colonial strategy, and also one that America readily applies everywhere, whether it be Latin America or wherever we have imperial interests. Yeah. So it's not shocking that Israel does the same thing. Okay, let's get back to this part. I'm glad that we parsed through this. I think because like these are very common talking points. And I feel like it's important to address the lies baked into that, because this is like pretty basic, like the way that I think Israeli history is taught in America, and I suspect in Israel as well, is quite similar to what he's presenting this as, and I feel like it's very one-sided and also ahistorical, does not feature the real conditions in which Palestinians were living under the occupation. And conditions that were horrible and were reported on quite frequently. That is precisely the reason why, I think it was Desmond Tutu, or it might have been Nelson Mandela. I mean, Nelson Mandela, who personally said that the apartheid was happening in Israel at the exact same time that it was happening in South Africa. And that condition has only worsened for the Palestinians in that time frame, whereas the apartheid has ended in South Africa.
Offered the Palestinians all the West Bank and East Jerusalem as their capital. They said no to every offer that was made to them, invested all the money they received from the world in terror, and then cried that they were their victims. The Palestinians do have a harder life than we Israelis, but they only have themselves to blame. So what is the solution?
There's always like little kids doing Halloween, but this time they're fucking
Israelis, but they only have themselves.
Like, this is such a funny, like, I mean, listen.
What is that supposed to be a photo of?
Yeah, he's just saying like they this is what Palestinians have to blame. Like, this is why they're like this, because this. It's like, okay, like therein lies. Here's the thing. Therein lies the difference between having a developed nation state that is like funded by the Western world versus being like having a government that has been declared a terror cell and is designed as a terrorist, where you wear your colors, like ultimately you're a terrorist, you're a little terrorist. Look at these little terrorists that are like born and bred to hate Israel and be anti-Semitic and blah blah blah. Whereas like no such. This is what I mean when I say there's always a double standard, where like no such assertions would ever be made if you see like little kids in Israel proper saying like they want to become IDF one day so they can, so they can defend Israel. When from his point of existence, from his framework, like that's kind of what he's doing,
Exactly.
Yeah. This is, again, a very weird and gross way to portray the entirety of the Palestinians as like people who are also under the banner of terrorism, under the banner of Hamas. Like, look at this, little kids are also like that. It's like a cultural problem. Look at this cultural identity problem that they have.
To blame. So what is the solution? When will there be peace? Not in the near future, because this conflict is not about the land. I've already told you that even before the 6-day war.
Yeah, I mean, if he puts more fucking photos of little kids, I'm gonna lose my goddamn mind. This is so insane. Like, what purpose does it serve other than to say like Palestinians are little fucking demons? Even as a child, look at them, like they're playing with RPG toys and shit, not understanding that like these are the conditions that you have subjected fucking children to. That all they know is an endless amount of fucking violence that they see or they've been taught is like the only emancipatory mechanism out of that is by fucking putting on a goddamn rocket propelled grenade over your shoulder.
It's like when you grow up in Gaza or the West Bank and you're subjected to daily harassment, daily checkpoints, daily home demolitions, daily land confiscations by Israelis carrying guns, driving in tanks, rolling through your towns and streets with their armored vehicles and their machine guns. It's like, what the hell did you think would happen?
Yeah, ridiculous. Oh, ridiculous. And the way to stop this is by going in the exact opposite direction, by the way. Like, there's no way to stop this. There's no way to stop the violence of the Israeli apartheid regime. There's no way to stop it until Israel decides to stop it, right? And the moment that Israel stops that violence is the moment where you starve out more radical components, more radical factions. The only reason why their influence has grown over the years is because Israel's provided no solutions out of this other than violent, other than a violent retaliation. What happens?
War, and even before 1948, the Palestinians were trying to wipe out the Jews. Here is another example. Take Gaza. In 2005, Israeli
By the way,
Gaza
just a quick point there. For decades before 1948, Zionists were debating how exactly they were going to establish a state in a land that was majority Arab Palestinian. How do you establish a Jewish state in a land that's mostly Arab Palestinian? In fact, you know what? And so they debated it. Some people were like, well, maybe we can convince the Palestinians to leave voluntarily. And then others were like, you know what? They're probably not going to leave voluntarily. We're probably going to have to expel them. And that was the debate that Zionists were having in the late 30s and 1940s. And so his point is literally you could really just flip Jews and Palestinians in this sentence right here, that Palestinians were trying to wipe out the Jews. If you flipped it and said Jews were debating how to wipe out Palestinians, that would be much more accurate.
Yeah. It's oh God, I think there's so much projection in every ounce of like in every single aspect of Zionist propaganda that like that's why I would say it's like you have to maintain a genocidal, slow ethnic cleansing apartheid structure in order to stop some hypothetical Islamist fundamentalist genocide from occurring down the line. And it's like that's no way to exist. That's no way to exist. Like this is that is at the heart of the problem, is that it requires a tremendous amount of violence for its maintenance, and I think it creates like delusional paranoid like a delusional paranoid collective psyche because everyone feels like, whether they recognize it or not, collectively responsible for the violence. It's really sad. Chomsky says calling it an apartheid is charitable to Israel. Yes, but apartheid is it. I'm old enough, even myself, at the age of 32, I'm old enough to remember a time when it was completely unacceptable to call Israel an apartheid state. That change has happened quite recently, a couple years back, actually, I think, when Amnesty International and the Human Rights Watch openly decided to call the apartheid regime an apartheid. So that's, and that was combated every step of the way, tooth and nail. So, and even now you see fucking, Amy Schumer post about how Israel is not an apartheid state because it has 20% Palestinians living in Israel proper, and it's actually a democracy. But what about the fucking 5 million Palestinians that live under occupation? Oh, well, they're not even mentioned in the process. Anyway.
That's sad.
Jews. Here is another example. Take Gaza. In 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip. Gaza is an Israeli and Jew-free area. The Palestinians get more money than any other group on the planet.
This is one of the most insidious of all the lies.
Yeah.
Israel withdrew, and Israel no longer controls Gaza. I mean, okay, well, let's see. Israel controls 6 of the 7 land borders and colludes with Egypt to control the 7th. Israel controls the coastline. Israel controls the airspace, the groundwater, the telecommunication networks, and thus internet access via those telecommunication networks. It also controls all the electricity that goes into Gaza, and it controls the population registry. So to pretend like Israel doesn't control Gaza is just to, I don't know, like, it's like, what kind of fantasy world are you living in? If Israel doesn't control Gaza, then why don't they just leave? Why don't they just get on a boat and leave?
Yeah, why can't Gazans fish beyond like the 6-mile coastline that was designated for them? Or why can't Palestinians have an airport? There was an airport there in 2001, right? I mean, in 2000 there was an airport there. What happened to the Palestinian airport? Why can't they rebuild it? Now the answer, depending on what seasoning of ultra Zionists you're talking to, will range from, well, it's a security concern, to because they're inferior and therefore they don't like to build and they only use all the concrete for tunnels and you know, throwing bombs into Israel. So, you know, but the real answer is because Israel bombed it and then they refused to allow Palestinians to rebuild it. That's the real answer.
That is 100% correct.
Yeah. Because they did 9/11. That's why they don't have an airport, said Michael Vick's cat. I mean, he's joking, by the way. He's not being serious. Yeah. Oh, my God. Thank God America wasn't like, I mean, they fucking invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. Might as well. Holy shit. They could have been like, Palestine is next.
Planet, from the US, from the European Union, from Arab countries, from the UN. And what do they do with this money? Infrastructure, education? No. They build tunnels and buy weapons to kill Jews.
I'm sorry. I love this argument. It's so psychotic. And it also literally is like, it's a reinforcement of, I am reminded originally of the time when this person said he does not like Benjamin Netanyahu, and he posted a photo in the beginning, I don't know if you remember, where he's like, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Benjamin Netanyahu, I disagree with them. What does he disagree with them on? Because this is like straight hyper right-wing, ultra-nationalist, ultra-Zionist propaganda. What do you disagree with them on? You don't disagree with them on the practice of like saying all Palestinians are fucking Hamas, and that all Hamas is doing is like taking the money from the international community and like building AK-47s. You know what I mean? Like that's. So what is it? Well, where is the difference in agreement? I don't get it. But yeah, the idea that like they're taking all of the aid and using it on weapons is really, really fucked up and really frustrating. I mean, we just raised $1 million for 4 Palestinian organizations that are working on the ground. This community, we're at $1,018,000 so far. And if you look at the internet, if you look at what people are saying online about it, it is fucking insane, especially on Reddit. Everyone's like, oh, that's not going to the Palestinian Red Crescent Society or the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. These are not organizations that are vetted and have to work with the Israeli government at all. These are actually Hamas funded cutouts. These are not going to like save children in Gaza that are currently being ruthlessly slaughtered under Israeli rocket fire. This is like giving Gazans more rockets. It's disgusting. It's dehumanizing. And unfortunately, it's a relatively successful propaganda that portrays all Arabs as like, non-human monsters that are simply just violently retaliating for no reason because they're barbaric. Yeah. Do you have a take on the they use all the money? I feel like I'm talking way too much. I need to shut the fuck up. You're my guest. You're way more knowledgeable on this stuff. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. I think you should say some stuff here about at least like where funds have been utilized historically.
I mean, look, for a long time, tunnels were used to import and to build an economy, right? Because Israel imposed a 16-year blockade and siege on Gaza that prevented things needed to live a basic human life, like cement, to rebuild all the buildings that were bombed. You know, Hamas built tunnels connecting the Egyptian side of Rafah to the Palestinian side of Rafah in order to be able to import and export everything, right? This was part of, you know, being able to build a normal economy. So, you know, it's just sort of trying to put things in context here. It's like, in addition, I would say, you know how much Israel spends on its military, you know? And by the way, the United States contributes to that. The United States gives Israel $4 billion in military aid every year. Why doesn't it? So it's like, well, you're going to criticize Hamas for, you know, buying, you know, getting weapons, but what about Israel? It's like, well, Palestinians kill Israelis, and Israelis kill 100 times as many Palestinians. You're not criticizing the weapons Israel gets and only the weapons that Hamas gets. It's just a double standard.
Yeah, because you slap the terrorist designation on it, and there's no like ministry. That's why you can very easily just say like, that's why you hear it all the time when people just go like, well, it's the Hamas health ministry that said this, or it's the Hamas this that is trying to engage in trade, and it's like, well, then all matter of trade that Palestinians are supposed to be doing in Gaza is just all terrorism. That is by design. That is the purpose of propping up Hamas, and then saying like this is a violent terrorist organization that does brutal things, and there is some truth to that. Obviously, there is a lot of violence that occurred, but that even in that is always left out in the dark without any sort of historical framework, and mentioned without offering any alternatives or a time when there were alternatives to that. So it's very frustrating. Every state is operated by their military technically. That's why Republicans say, or conservatives in America say, like, taxation is theft, and it's like stolen. It's stolen from you at gunpoint because the state has a monopoly on violence. You know, you can make that argument for every fucking nation state.
Yeah, Muhammad Al-Kurd had a nice video where he illustrated how everything in Gaza is labeled like Hamas-run health minister, Hamas-run hospital, Hamas-run education, you know, Hamas-run blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, it's like there's a very specific reason why media outlets are doing that, right? It's like trying to brand everyone and everything and everybody in Gaza as a terrorist.
Yeah.
And it's like incredibly dehumanizing. Like, you know, like doctors are terrorists, you know, school teachers are terrorists. It's disgusting.
Well, it served the purpose of like justifying their death and destruction in the hands of the Israeli state. They're all terrorists, so they're all human shields. They're all terrorists, and they're not real humans. So when these children die, 1,000 of them in the last siege so far, it's considered to be appropriate. That way, it is much easier to believe the propaganda that, like, well, these guys are human shields. You know, these children were human shields, or that was a sacrifice that we could make, and it was justifiable violence.
Why do they do that? The Hamas constitution makes it very clear. The first sentence is, Israel will exist until Islam wipes it out. It doesn't say we want peace. It doesn't say we want a Palestinian state.
Yeah, no, as opposed to like the the origination of the Israeli nation state, which was always very peaceful, where the Israelis were like, here, we'll kiss you guys out of the villages that you will leave voluntarily. Because you're like, oh, stop tickling me. You're tickling me too much. But again, that is the 1988 Hamas Charter. Hamas at the time was like a fucking marginal group that you also have mentioned was you explain it. Sorry, fuck. What am I doing? Go ahead, please address these takes. I'm done. No, you're only you from now on. Fuck.
Please, no, you're killing it. Please continue. Look, the only thing I would add is that, you know, obviously Hamas started as an Islamic charity. Before the charter of August 1988, in the first the Intifada broke out in 87, right? And in late 87, in that first year after the Intifada, Israeli military forces killed 142 people in the Gaza Strip, all the while suffering a grand total of 0 casualties. And this inflamed the Islamic Charity, the Mujamma, and Al-Mujamma al-Islamiyya is what was called before 88. And they were inflamed and enraged and radicalized as a result of the grotesque Israeli violence. So that's the first point I would make. Secondly, already before August 88, you have multiple proposals from leading Hamas officials, including Sheikh Ahmed Yassin himself, as well as another guy, another senior official, basically putting forward kind of peace feelers to Israel at the time that were obviously completely rejected outright. And because those peace officers involved Palestinian self-determination, a withdrawal from the occupied territories, and a return of the refugees, all of which are total non-starters for the state of Israel, which is hell-bent on preserving its Jewish majority at all costs. No matter how much violence Israelis will face, they would rather have many thousands of Israelis massacred than let back in Palestinian refugees or give up control of Palestinian land. I mean, that's the first point I would make. And then, by the 2000s, by 2006, you have another proposal by Esma al-Haniya, who publishes a piece, I believe, in The Guardian, basically saying, look, we're open to peace with Israel. Same thing happens in 2008 with Khalid Mash'al, publishes another op-ed, I believe, in The Guardian, basically saying, look, we're open to a 10-year truce. And then in 2012, you have the second command the second military commander in the Hamas military wing, Ahmed Ja'bari, I believe was his name, who just a few hours before being assassinated by Israel had received a peace deal, had received the draft of a peace deal that was the result of months-long negotiation process between backdoor channels between Hamas and the State of Israel that received the full support and approval of then Defense Minister Ehud Barak. A few hours after Ahmed Ja'bari received the peace proposal, he was assassinated along with 6 other Palestinians, because Israel had no interest in a peace deal with Hamas at that point. Israel wanted to strengthen its deterrence capacity and destroy as many Hamas leaders as it could. Israel chose war over peace. And so, and basically, I would say that's kind of been the status quo for almost a decade now, which is that Israel's more or less happy to have Hamas on its southwestern flank because it means that it doesn't have to negotiate with the Palestinians. Because look, they're divided. Look, they all they want to do is send rockets at us. They're all terrorists. And this gave Israel the plausible deniability it needed to claim that it was the Palestinians that rejected peace, not the Israelis. So again, there's a lot of kind of selectively choosing facts here in this narrative, and this is just a classic example of it.
Yeah.
State. It clearly says until Islam wipes it out, they want a Muslim caliphate. I respect Hamas for one thing only, for actually expressing and being clear about what they want.
Yeah, except he's like, I respect Hamas for saying this so I can use it to say that all Palestinians love Hamas, and also Hamas wants to ethnically cleanse all Jews from Israel. I respect them for saying that because it makes propagandizing against Palestinians much easier, which is literally identical to Benjamin Netanyahu's perspective and his design for how to thwart a Palestinian nation state being developed, which is, even funnier when he says, this is the Israeli perspective you've never heard. I've heard this perspective. I've only heard this perspective. I've never heard another perspective. This was not a unique one at all. Sorry.
Which is to eliminate Israel. Personally, I want the Palestinians to have a democratic state with human rights and freedoms. And I wish for all Arabs and Muslims to have the same. But what I want is not necessarily what they want. To solve the problem, you need to understand the problem. And the problem...
This guy's a good understander of the problem. I'm feeling like he totally has a good grasp on the situation after what he just said.
Is made up of 2 things. One which Westerners don't understand anymore, religion, and one which Westerners don't want to talk about, values. Religion plays no role at all in European politics.
What?
I think honestly, like the last 6 minutes of this video is like him just spewing anti-Muslim and anti-Arab hate, and just sort of demonizing all Muslims all around the world, and it's pretty wild, honestly. Like he should have just stopped the video here because the last 6 minutes are just like not helping his cause.
No, I love this. I'm excited to hear a guy who said Hamas is a certain way, and then immediately speaks like the cartoonish depiction of how like all Palestinians are in his eyes, but with a role reversal. It's always so funny when people are like, Yeah, these guys are like Islamist fundamentalists that want to wipe out everybody, and then they turn and you know, think that like all Jewish people are demons or whatever, and then immediately turn around and start talking about all Arabs as like pests that must be expelled forcibly because they're ruining like the beautiful European culture or whatever the fuck, you know, and it just simply cannot coexist in beautiful white Europe. With their rape gangs or whatever the fuck they say. It's just so frustrating.
In the US, politicians do say God bless America, and the debate surrounding abortion is partly religious. But when it comes to foreign policies, you don't hear American generals talk about spreading the word of Jesus.
That's literally objectively false. George W. Bush said God told him to invade Iraq. There were plenty of generals at the time who talked about how this was the Holy Crusade. Plenty of soldiers also love Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, and you know, we're bearing the cross when they were in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is completely and objectively and utterly false. The only difference is that because it's Christian, it's the dominant ethnic, ethno-religious group, that nobody actually sees that as like an aberration or weird or gross or religious. Having said that, none of these things are actually religious. None of these conflicts are actually born out of religion. It's just a material interest in grabbing as much land as possible or an extraction of natural resources. It's just religion is the seasoning that you add to it, and sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. Oh my God, I'm doing the same thing again. Sorry, Zach, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, Hasan, I have to actually confess something, which is that I didn't realize you were Turkish. Sen Türk olduğunu hiç bilmedim ya.
Oh wow, you speak Turkish? That's crazy. Wait, what did you think I was? Yeah. My name is Hasan. What?
Yo, I honestly didn't know. I apologize. I didn't do my homework before this chat.
No, you were like, damn, this white boy's spitting. Why does he care about Palestinians so much? What the fuck? Is that what you thought?
I figured. No, I thought you were Arab, actually. I didn't realize you were Turkish.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I am. Don't worry. That's what the Turks... Don't worry. That's what the fucking Turks in my chat have been saying these past couple of days as well. That I'm Arab and not Turkish anymore because I defend Palestinians.
Man, we didn't even talk about Mavi Marmara. You know, I feel like we should.
I have
that up at some point.
I did. Okay. I brought it up in a Turkish rant when I was yelling at the Turks, saying that like some of you think you are more supreme than Arabs and think you're Western backed and think that the West sees you as anything different. But you know, Israel could do 100 Mavi Marmaras and the Western world would not turn the Western world would turn a blind eye to it. They got really mad at me.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry for distracting us from the video. I did not realize that, and so I wanted to share some Turkish love with you.
Yeah, hell yeah. All right, let's continue with this racist.
In the Muslim world, it is very different. When Arabs kill Jews at a music festival, or Christians in a school in Nigeria, or one another in Syria, Yemen, Libya, what is it they shout? Allahu Akbar, God is great.
Oh my God!
A religious war against the infidels. To many Europeans, the words infidels and
dude, he's so good. He's spitting. I've never heard this one before. That's crazy. The unified Islamic jihadists across the board. Wow, this is some post 9/11 shit right here. This is like, I feel like this is 2002. You know, good stuff.
Yeah, this is very reminiscent of the anti-Muslim bigotry that was so pervasive in the aftermath of 9/11.
Yeah, this is like some of our more important thinkers, like Sam Harris, channeled this intellectual school of thought. It's great. Yeah, this is like incredibly reductive Reddit atheism analysis, but. Of course, I don't expect that from the likes of Sam Harris, who fancies himself to be an intellectual. I do expect that from some fucking random guy who has a travelingtoisrael.com blog on YouTube. So it's a little bit different when you hear it from someone who is supposedly a part of the intelligentsia.
Heresy probably remind them of dark days that played out hundreds of years ago when Catholics and Protestants were killing each other. Sadly, this is still the situation in some parts of the Muslim world. Just think about the organizations you hear about in the Muslim world: Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, the Taliban. These aren't national organizations. They are all religious organizations. Now let's talk about the bigger issue, values. Lots of people run from...
Wow. Yeah, let's move past that one. He's like, all Muslims are run under Islamist fundamentalist groups that the Western world has placed upon damn near the entirety of the fucking world under the auspices of defeating Cold War, defeating the socialist influence of the Cold War. Like, it's great. I love that. It's because everyone was volunteering that. They were like, I love being ruled by the Taliban. It's so stupid. I'm sorry. Do you have anything to say about this? I mean, this is like moving beyond Palestine at this point. It's just like straight up being fucking a psychotic freak. But I love that he said he likes facts, though. Facts.
Well, look, I think when thinking about religious violence, I would say that you really do need to take a bird's eye view here, because otherwise what you're actually doing is you're trying to understand political and social and economic history rather than religions and religious history. And when you kind of zoom out and take a bird's eye view, Christians have been some of the most violent and some of the most, and have used Christianity in the name of violence as much as anyone else historically. And so, I don't understand why all of a sudden he's sort of like going to pretend like ancient history doesn't matter anymore when thinking about like what religions are violent and what religions are peaceful. But like, he's not really interested in understanding violence and peace and what religions have to say about them. He's just looking to demonize Muslims and brand Hamas as an extremist religious organization that is indistinguishable from all these others, and it's just part of this bigger problem, which is Islam. And that's
which is ironic because, like, obviously it is anti-Semitic to claim that Zionism is inherently in the interest of all Jews all around the world. And I will always make that distinction that, like, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism and Jews are not a monolith, and it's fucking ridiculous to claim such a thing. And yet, like, I feel like he gave so much religious context originally, or at least utilized religion originally to talk about how important, like, Israel is and has to be developed. And in that same breath, of course, omits key details and like the endless amount of violence that was done to justify a Jewish nation state, to erect a Jewish nation state, not realizing that, like, from that same reductive lens, that is ironic that you're saying that, like, oh no, we have a Jewish theocracy that we are interested in developing, interested in building, and that the building of said theocratic apartheid structure, of course, is like incredibly violent and forcibly expels everyone that is considered to not be a part of the in-group. And then and he ties it back to religion in the same way. In many ways, like, that from a reductive lens, it's identical, but just with a role reversal. And one is an established nation state, so you understand that that's, like, appropriate, and the other is not. It's a militant group. And I'm doing it again.
Yeah. Look, I think most historians, if not pretty much all historians of Israel-Palestine, agree that the issue is land. It's not religion. And I think the problem with this entire video is that he's obsessed with religion and wants to place religion at the center of the conflict. But guess what? Long before there was Hamas, long before there was Islamic Jihad, there was a fight over the land. And that fight over the land will continue long after Palestinians decide there are better ways of trying to reconquer that land than embracing kind of fundamentalist Islam. So again, like, it really to me highlights his misunderstanding of the fundamental issue on the table here, which is that you have two people. One came from outside of Palestine and wanted to control Palestine. One was already living in Palestine and is defending Palestine from that conquest and from that invasion and from that occupation and from that siege. And that's the fundamental issue. And religion is exploited by both sides. It's used by both sides, but it's not the main issue. It's a tool. It's a weapon that is used. That's kind of how I would interpret things. And I think, by the way, the overwhelming majority of serious historians would agree with me.
Yeah.
From this as if they were running from fire, because the biggest concern is potentially being called a racist. I want to be 100% clear here, although I know that some will do their best to misunderstand me. If I say that men are more violent than women, does it mean I hate all men? No. Does it mean that I think all men are violent? No. Does it mean that there are no violent women?
Oh, God, I know where this is going. He's going to be Islamophobic, but in a woke way. Like, yeah, when I say men are more violent than women, I mean statistically. So when I say Muslims are more violent than Christians in Europe, I mean statistically. He's like, dude, that's so sick. The Israeli government is basically invented pinkwashing and greenwashing an apartheid structure. So like, it's cool that he is continuing on with this tradition by doing 1350 style racist agitprop, but in a woke way. Like, just like how men dominate women in a patriarchal structure, Muslims are dominating Europeans in an Islamic caliphate that has been established in Europe.
Yeah.
No. But if in almost all countries, more than 90% of those in chairs are men, then you can say that men are more violent than women. I believe you can criticize anyone for anything. You can criticize me as a Jew, as an Israeli, as a man, as a tour guide. You can criticize me for things I can't change.
He's a
like
tour
my
guide?
identity, and for the things I chose, like my profession.
When I was looking at his YouTube channel, it's like he's going around and like, taking you on a tour of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or whatever else. I think that's his whole jam.
He's like, here's where the primitive Arab dogs used to live, who we forcibly expelled. Thank God. What the fuck? What is he talking about? What kind of tours is he giving? Oh God, I actually kind of want to know.
Music I like.
He's like, here's the extra racist tour of Israel.
The fact that I'm a father, my identity is comprised of thousands of different aspects, and you can criticize any one of them, and I can agree or disagree. I can say, true, Israelis aren't very polite and they don't know how to form a queue, but I'm different. And I can also accept that criticism. If you are not a narcissist, you know that you're not perfect. I don't subscribe to the narrative that you are only allowed to say good things about other groups and criticize your own. I actually want to be criticized. I want to be made to think, to be made to improve my ways. The Me Too movement.
I really do hope maybe he'll see this video that will inevitably come out of this, where we like parse through all the things that he said, and maybe he'll just come out as like a rugged anti-Zionist. He's like, I started reading Ilan Pape, I started reading Finkelstein. I had no idea what was going on.
So I'm just scrolling through his YouTube channel, and it's not just like very like apolitical travel guides to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's also like political content. Like he has produced plenty of political content before, so this is nothing. He's not new to politics.
Yeah, I kind of want to see his tours.
Movement made me rethink the way I interact with women and made me more aware of the language I use. I criticize all groups: Americans, Germans, Britney Spears fans, ultra-Orthodox Jews, women, Gen Z, and Muslims. I even criticize the most dangerous group of all, Israeli mothers. If a teacher writes that she is sick, there is no need for 30 get well soon messages. You don't show that you care by writing a message. You're just spamming my WhatsApp. If there were peace in all of the Middle East and only the Arab Muslim Palestinians were resorting to violence, I would say, okay, maybe we are in the wrong. But if the Palestinians were using violence before 1967 and before 1948, and almost all of the Arab Muslim countries are dictatorships with high levels of violence and low levels of human rights, then
when I made that
maybe
comment about how he's dehumanizing and he's being incredibly bigoted towards Muslims. I mean, this is exactly what I was talking about. Basically, if you just go back like 5-10 seconds, like he just makes his point that basically, look, there's nothing we can do because Muslims are just violent, and that's the problem.
Yeah, no, this is identical to the argument that like black people are inferior. This is what white supremacists say about black people, and then they point to like Africa without any consideration of like the violence of colonization and imperialism and the theft of natural resources, to just kind of say like, look at the structure. It's really fucked up. Must have something to do with how black people are, and that's just like an insanely racist thing to say. And that's what he's doing. But this is a little bit more permissible because it's against Arabs and Muslims, and that has been for a very long time the justification for post 9/11 expansion in the Middle East. And obviously the reaction to said expansion. So yeah. He's a teacher. Dude, he taught me a lot. He taught me new ways of being racist. Yeah. As Parenti says, Africa is not underdeveloped, it's overexploited. Yes. Yeah. All matter of Arab nations that he's pointing to and claiming are like Islamist fundamentalists. are the way that they are due to external factors. They are under reactionary rule for the most part because of the circumstances of their development, because of Western influence in their development, in a way that is not dissimilar to Hamas growing in influence, both as a byproduct of the violent conditions that people were subjected to by a colonial power, but also by directly funding and facilitating its growth. The said Western powers directly funding and facilitating its growth in every single structure, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's really
I
a
feel like
problem here.
I've kept you here for like 3 fucking hours, and all I've done is just like yap. I'm sorry. I'm so
No, you should not be apologizing for anything. Come on, don't be silly.
This is what I do every day for 10 hours. So they already hear me all the time. I have to pee. You can keep going on this.
I'm also getting comments from Muslims
let it roll. Let it roll.
colonialism and the Americans for all the problems in the Muslim world. And it is true that the creation of many countries and borders in Africa and Asia were determined by the interest of the European empires, and that the US think primarily about its own interest. But I'm always shocked to find that Muslims take no responsibility for their wrongdoing. The fact that most of the Muslim countries aren't democratic has nothing to do with the US. The fact that 17 of the 20 most dangerous countries for the LGBTQ community are Muslims has nothing to do with colonialism. The fact that almost all of the most dangerous places in the world to be Christians are Muslim has nothing to do with imperialism. The Muslim world is huge. It has a lot of oil, and its failure has very little to do with colonialism. Look at the Jews. 1/3 of them were murdered by the Nazis. Israel has no oil, and it is surrounded by enemies, and yet we are successful. And it's not because of American money. Most of that money has to be used to buy military equipment from American companies. And besides, the Palestinians get way more money. We are successful because we are open-minded, think outside the box, invest in education.
Israel gets
and are
way
not
more
violent.
money than the Palestinians.
This is
That's
true
just a straight
outside
up
the
lie.
Middle East too. Look
Israel
at
gets
Arab
$4
Muslim
billion
communities
a
in
year.
Europe.
The
If
Palestinians
there were
get
violent
much
riots
less.
in Paris or Sweden,
Less
Rotterdam
than
or
$1 billion,
London,
maybe 800 million, which is now in the process of being taken away from them. So that there was a lie that was repeated there. But what can you do?
Wait, what was it? I'm sorry, I missed it.
It was just one. It was just one insidious lie that he says the Palestinians get way more money than than Israel, which is just a straight up lie. Which is that the United States provides Israel in just the past fiscal year $3.8 billion. The Palestinians get way less than that.
Yeah.
I can't recall the exact amount. We can look it up, but it's way less than that.
Okay.
Almost done. I mean, at this point, he's just.
Yeah, he's just adding a couple. I really do appreciate it because like at the end of it, he just kind of really betrays the facts based analysis that he was supposedly offering, where he like omits key details and obviously tries to repeat like propaganda, make this position seem way more agreeable. And then the last 6 minutes of it, as you said, is just straight like. And, you know, those Arab Muslims are fucking barbaric, brutal, racist, that want to kill everybody and throw gays off roofs, you know? Like,
yeah, it's just, yeah. Go ahead.
And also, yes, Arabs get more money than Israel, which is a lie. Okay.
in the Jewish neighborhoods or the Arab neighborhoods. Peace will only come when the Arabs change their values, when Muslim countries become democratic, when all of the different groups in Syria stop.
Yeah, like Israel. Democratic like Israel. An apartheid state.
Killing one another, when Iranian women are free to cover or not cover their hair, when gay men are not thrown from rooftops in Gaza.
Oh, he said it. Oh my God. He said it. He did the ISIS line. He said gay men are thrown off of rooftops in Gaza. Oh God.
Oh my God.
What a fucking gross little pervert gremlin he is for that. Jesus Christ, dude. Yeah. Let me just explain something to the people that always like hear this most likely. Oh, like the Queers for Palestine movement. First of all, Palestinians are diverse. They're, of course, queer Palestinians. That's number one. Openly queer Palestinians especially as well. And not only that, but also one thing that these Americans usually and this Israeli person is doing in this circumstance is that they forget that these people, Palestinians, just like I usually talk about my own personal experience, like Turks are not allowed to get to have their own civil liberties movement when they're too busy fighting against colonial oppression. It's so fucking stupid that people always go, oh, well, you wouldn't be able to be gay in Palestine. And it's like, you don't know that. You have no idea. You have no idea what that would look like because there has not been a free Palestinian nation. It's ridiculous. There's never been a moment for people to breathe so that they can, fix their own houses, if you want to call it that. It's so stupid. There's also, this is often also another ahistorical perspective, which is like that the Ottoman Empire, for example, going back to that again, was notoriously more open-minded towards homosexuality than its Western counterparts were. Like, sodomy was literally decriminalized. It wasn't illegal, but then it was purposely decriminalized in the Tanzimat era in the 18th century, at a time when it was absolutely illegal in the Western world. And so, anyway, it's just a very weird, ahistorical approach that also is like very like unnecessarily supremacist, that makes it seem like people are in these conditions because they have like wrong opinions.
Yeah, I agree with you.
To
How do you do
jail
this for
by
like 10
the
hours a
PLO.
day?
I do. I love it, man. I never shut the fuck up. I'm yapping nonstop.
When the
We're
Christian
almost done.
population stopped shrinking in the Middle East, and when the Israeli Arabs stop killing one another, then and only then will there be true peace. Please like and share this video with any friend who needs.
Yeah, he says Arabs need to like go against their values. Okay, got it. So that's what the problem is. I love that was his conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, he really goes off the rails there in the last 6-7 minutes, where he's stopped talking about Israel-Palestine a long time ago, and now is just on a mission to brand all Palestinians as Islamic fundamentalists, and then pretend like the real problem here is Islam, which again is just like a real misreading of the situation on the ground in Israel-Palestine. Kind of, you're misunderstanding what people are fighting over.
Yeah,
but.
It's also
Anyways.
odd because like his own like Jewish theocratic state is currently going through internal struggles, as like the Supreme Court that is supposed to be a secular institution is becoming neutered, and the far right, down to people that are anti-miscegenation and anti-LGBT are seizing control of a right-wing government. And he claims he hates that. I don't know if he actually hates that or if he's just simply saying that to like push for his position and or maybe present his position as like somehow different than other people. But it certainly doesn't seem like he hates it all that much, at least on the land grab aspect of it. And
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, but like I would never make the argument that Israelis are monolithic, is what I'm saying, or that all Jews are the same. I would never say that it's anti-Semitic as fuck.
He takes the argument that I've seen a lot of both Israelis and Jews take over the years, which is that within the community, when we're speaking amongst ourselves or when we're speaking in Hebrew, we're happy to criticize our own. But when it comes to putting out, when it comes to, like talking about Israel and Palestine with the world, we're all exactly the same. We all support Israel. And by the way, I think that's why American Jews have been so reluctant and so hesitant over the past, call it 9 months, to speak out against what's happening within Israel, the quote-unquote judicial reform effort to basically completely neuter the judiciary and prevent them from having any oversight over government decisions, right? But I think, I actually take him at his word when he says I reject the Netanyahu government. I would just say that he's unwilling to talk about that with other people, even though, by the way, he himself have just said, like, I actually am open. His whole mantra is like, I'm open-minded. I'm happy to criticize anybody for anything. But in fact, it's very clear. I don't think he spoke out. He he had literally zero negative things to say about the state of Israel. He had zero criticism over any action ever taken by any Zionist or any Israeli, which is kind of undermines this whole argument about sort of like being open-minded and so on. So